Hello, and welcome to this live-streamed web seminar debating dirty politics, media, politics and law, broadcasting from the University of Otago's broadcasting studio. My name's Andrew Geddis. I'm a professor at the University of Otago's law faculty. Love it or loathe it, the publication of Nicky Hager's Dirty Politics has lit a fire under our perception of politics as usual in New Zealand. We won't be able to see the book's full impact on the fortunes of all the political parties until September the 20th. But beyond the effect on the upcoming election, Dirty Politics raises a number of important questions across a range of different issues, without necessarily giving full or satisfactory answers. These are issues that go beyond the who said what to whom and what email stories that the media understandably has been concentrating on in recent weeks. In an effort to move past such discussions and instead debate the bigger picture, we have today brought together a number of academics from the University of Otago's Department of Media, Film and Communications, Department of Politics, Faculty of Law, National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, and the University of Canterbury's School of Law. This afternoon's event will be structured as follows. Shortly, we will hear from the author of Dirty Politics, Mr. Nicky Hager, who will discuss what he identifies as being the major themes and threats to our political processes that emerge from his investigations. We will then have three successive panels of academic commentators drawn from the disciplinary fields of media, politics and law, who will debate and discuss what they take to be the important issues raised by Mr. Hager's work. Once these panels have concluded, Mr. Hager will return to the podium and give us his response to the day's discussion. Now, while you're watching us this afternoon, we'd love to have you participate and send us your questions through Twitter. You can do so at any time by tweeting the handle @HagerDebate or using the hashtag HagerDebate. Once again, that's @HagerDebate or hashtag HagerDebate. To begin proceedings, we'll hear from the author of Dirty Politics, Mr. Nicky Hager, discussing his work with Dr Bryce Edwards from the University of Otago's Department of Politics.
Okay, thanks Andrew. Welcome Nicky Hager. Now, as Andrew's just said, what we're trying to do with this symposium today is try and take the bigger picture view, the larger picture. So, you've thrown this huge grenade into politics and into New Zealand society, and we've had so much debate and discussion on really important things, but there's always the tension or this tendency to shift towards looking at who said what, who's throwing the mud, who are the villains, and there's a lot of ugliness in all of this debate, which you've done really well to highlight. But the worry, of course, is always that the election will finish and we'll move on, and some of the bigger things to come out of it aren't discussed. So that's really what we're trying to do in this symposium today, to try and push the debate and focus on what this really means for democracy, for the media, for politics, for law. So as a way of kind of discussing that, I just thought I'd ask you about what you think students should be studying if they're interested in this debate, because I've already noticed a huge interest in your book on campus from politics students in particular, right from the first year level through to postgrad students. And so I just thought I'd go through the different disciplines, because we're looking here at media, at politics and law. And if students were setting off to do an essay at stage 1 level, or if they were wanting to do a PhD relating to this topic, and I'm sure they will, what would you advise? So perhaps starting with the politics discipline.
Well, let me take a big picture first before I give you some answers. Yeah. And the big picture is that although a book like this is about incidents and personalities and things which are hidden, the whole purpose for writing it is to say, why is politics like it is? Like, why do the things that happen the way they do? Which is what interests me, which is what I saw this information as being an opportunity to illuminate. And so I hope that if students look at this, that's exactly the way they'll look at it. They'll step back and not think, did the polls go up? Did the polls go down? Who won the election? Which are really passing things. They're not the point of it. It's about how does this help to explain how people are feeling about politics, who's being heard, who's being left out of politics, as I say, why it is like it is. And so I'll tell you the first thing I would say. The central idea of the book was an idea that comes out of US Republican politics called two-track approach to managing public opinion. And this comes from over the last decade, generation, where US politics has had a huge increase in the use of negative politics. Negative politics has been found to be very useful, partially for moving voters, but actually more so for alienating voters. That what people can target and attempt to do in their politics is to, by their tactics, basically switch people off. Yeah. Just think, politics, it's revolting, they're all the same, it's all dirty, I'll just do something else because I don't believe in it. And that's actually a specific political tactic. But the other thing that they learned in the US experience was that the people who do the negative politics also take a risk, that they themselves look like they're doing something wrong. So while they're trying to turn off their opponents' supporters by their advertising or their statements, they risk looking bad themselves, obviously because they're attacking, smearing. And that's where the two-track approach came from in US politics. And what it was where the leadership of the party is kept supposedly above dirty politics, positive, friendly, kissing babies, refusing to engage in negative politics, while simultaneously they have arm's length allies, other people who do the attacks and smears and attack ads and the rest of it. And that's actually a very good description of what has been happening in New Zealand with a consistently popular, relaxed and friendly leader, and yet this confusing period of more personal attacks, more people feeling scared or pushed or harassed out of politics, a constant series of trippings up and miniature scandals which seem to turn up like the weather but have actually been manufactured and come and go in the news. All this stuff's been going on and people haven't understood what's going on with it. So the first thing I would say is, I just think with that idea in mind, any students who wanted to look at what's been going on in the past and the present, beyond the election, wherever, and try to analyse more deeply why politics is like it is, have got a really strong framework for doing that.
So how would they do it? Would they look at the advertising of politicians, or look at their speeches, or where would they dig? Where would they start looking at the politics?
Well, there's two parts to it really. One is that at the manufacturing of image. A modern leader of any party is doing continuous impression management. And so it's actually just looking at the PR strategies involved in what they say, the questions they don't answer, the language that they use. But actually the more important part, the part which I believe is the reason why there's been such a strong reaction to the book I wrote, is to look at the attack side, the bit which has been invisible because it just didn't fit narrative. We had a friendly, relaxed leader. And so what was all this other stuff? It actually went below the radar. And it's looking at how many people who have engaged in politics in different ways, from political leaders right down to ordinary people who write on a blog post or go on a protest or try to take public interest voices. How many of those have been harassed or felt pushed out of politics in recent years?
So it's the suppression of public participation in politics.
Yes.
And so you are looking for some way of cleaning up politics and getting the participation going again. I mean, can it be done?
Yes. My whole approach to politics, my whole belief in politics is that we shouldn't go down the road of pessimism. Pessimism is where you think there's all these bad things and it will only get worse, which I don't believe in. I think that what we're seeing here, the way that politics actually proceeds is, for example, in my book, The Hollow Men, one of the strong bits there which helped me to decide to want to work on it was the use of racism as a tool by a mainstream party. And it was a very effective tool, but exposing it meant that the government that followed it, which is the John Key government, has not used racism in the same way. And I think it's the same with other kinds of tools, that if they're exposed and if there's proper discussion about it, people get it, and it's harder to use the same tactics.
Aren't you just suggesting, though, that they go onto different tools and different messages and basically politics stays the same? Isn't there a need for something much larger for correcting politics than just kind of getting people participating and highlighting where it's wrong?
No, I actually think that it's just the long-term fight between more honest and more transparent politics and less honest and less transparent. And that's a long-term fight. And and you fight each fire and you expose each trick, and it makes it better. But the issue to think about at the moment, which you named it, is about participation. I think that in New Zealand politics, the dividing line is not between the left and the right. It's actually between people participating and people not participating. That's where the battleground is, in fact. That the tactics which I've written about and which you see in lots of ways in politics is about switching people off. And so that's a fight that's manageable. Pendulum swing. Things get better and worse.
But do you think there's something to participate in politics? I mean, you can get involved in parties, but it seems to be the lesson from Hollow Men is it's all the people at the top that have the power, and activists or members don't have anything. You can vote in elections, but it doesn't seem to have a big impact on anything.
That's the pessimistic story, which has got truth in it. The other story is that people who get organised and who care about things and who are not put off have more effect than most politicians do. And so if the issue is about participation, then it's about people who care about it. What is their answer? It's to be more active. It's to be role models of being politically active. It's actually to look at, in fact, I think even more than activity is about the voices which are heard. One of the things which is deeply disempowering is if you're a member of the public, you hear a policy talked about which sounds right to you, and then most of the voices heard in the public space seem to be dumping on it, and it's not going anywhere. I think that nature of our political environment is a key area for people to be studying.
Part of that's the media, isn't it? Voices and ways of getting the message out there. So
it's slightly the media. It's actually mostly not the media.
Okay.
That what if you did a kind of a stock take of New Zealand politics. This is not what my book's about, but this is, I feel strongly about. This is the context of my book. If you did a stock take of the commentators, the main media people, who comments when a new policy is announced, there's something really fishy about it. But we all tend to take reality just as being that's the way things are. But actually it's the result of decisions. It's the result of people paying to set up think tanks and paying to set up, paid industry lobbyists. It's the decisions about who gets chosen by the news media to be the commentators.
Sure.
These are key issues.
Okay, well, you've raised lots of important points that I think we will look at in the panels that are coming next. Just quickly on law, what sort of areas can we change or focus on? Can law students study or investigate?
There was a really key issue in my book, which is about the way that blogs, which were this new event in politics, which no one knew what to do with, the way that they could be used as an unregulated zone to do things that mainstream media wouldn't. They didn't have to be accurate, they didn't have to be fair, they didn't have to be balanced, but if they were prominent, they infected the way the mainstream media did things. It's a very important area of looking whether that can be re-regulated and stop the media being undermined.
Okay, lots of big issues there. We'll pass it back to Andrew now, and he'll introduce the next panel, I believe.
Well, thank you, Dr Edwards and Mr Hager. There'll now be a short break in proceedings while we bring on our first discussant panel to explore the media issues raised by the Dirty Politics book. Thank you. Off air for a moment. Welcome back. We turn now to our first panel, which will look at the media issues arising out of the Dirty Politics book. To do so are four members of Otago's Department of Media, Film and Communications, Dr Rosemary Overell, Dr Holly Randell-Moon, Dr Brett Nicholls and Dr John Farnsworth. They're going to talk for about 40 minutes, at the end of which there'll be an opportunity for questions to the panellists. So send them in to us through Twitter at Hager Debate or using the hashtag Hager Debate. Thank you.
Well, I think I'm starting things off. My name's John Farnsworth. What we're interested in is the fact that, certainly from my perspective, this has been one of the most mediatised elections that certainly I can remember. The issue for us which arises from that is, what does it mean that it's a mediatised election, and what have been the consequences, or what are the consequences of that, since the election is far from over at the moment? So what we're interested in doing is looking at how the media has affected the election issues, affected the issues that have arisen with dirty politics and a number of the other things that are around that. So it's the shift between the old forms of media, which have been some of the mass media forms, and the new and more contemporary social media forms, because from our perspective there have been a lot of changes, and they shape and reshape, it would seem, certainly from my perspective, to reshape the kinds of ways that the kind of talk that politics gets done, and therefore the impact on the political system as a whole. So the way that we're going to do this is that each of us are going to say a couple of things just to set things going, and we're then going to go into a much more free-form discussion, and hopefully from that quite a number of things will arise. So just to say, there are probably three areas that we're interested in looking at. The first of those would be the issue of media production and consumption. And that's not just social media, but that's also the media institutions and anything that's concerned with how the media get produced, and then again the impact that they have on politics. The second one is the role of journalism itself. Again, that's been a really important part of the way that media politics has unrolled in the past few weeks, and perhaps in some ways it's been different than it might have been the case in previous elections. So that'd be the second area. And the third is, of course, politics itself, and the way that the media have inflected or shifted or changed the way that politics is talked about, constructed, engaged with the public, or the public has engaged with political figures, so those kinds of areas. So those would be the three things, the three broad areas that I think that we're going to talk about between all four of us. So I guess one of the things that I'm interested in, and Nicky Hager has already raised it, is around the issue of public opinion and the management of public opinion, because it is one of the almost self-evident cases that where social media are concerned, there has been the management of public opinion in ways that were evident last election and were evident to a lesser extension the election before, but which are absolutely in the forefront now. And that has been the rise of Twitter, it's been the rise of blogging, and the variety of blogs there have been. And there's been both the forefront staging of that and the back of it. And Nicky Hager's book, of course, has revealed a great deal about what that backstaging has been. So, of course, we're interested in that, because one of the issues that comes from that is how media politics constructed by the ways that different kinds of talk and conversation and discourses are managed by particular parties to that process, whether they're, as he mentioned, think tanks or they're other people. So that's one of the issues that I'm certainly interested in exploring a bit further. And the other one, I think, is around the area of journalism. What I would say with that is that, in my view, Nicky Hager has been acting as a whistleblower, and it's not the first time that he's acted in this capacity. People will probably remember his book, The Hollow Men, which subsequently became a documentary. And that in itself was a kind of whistleblowing book, not with the kind of impact that his most recent book has had. But what that has emerges out of that is, in a kind of counterface, is the role of the journalistic profession itself. How has it responded to that? What has it made of it? Is there a division between journalism and commentary? Are commentators a different species to journalists? And how has that reflected across the range of domains on which they talk or present their work, whether it's written or filmed or audio? And again, that's another set of issues which I think are quite salient when it comes to this particular book and the sets of events that have arisen from it. So anyway, I'll leave that at that, but I'll pass us over to Brett Nicholls.
Thanks, John. For me, I think to build on what John was saying, my own interest in Nicky's book is, I think the book emerges at a very interesting time where we are seeing the reconfiguration of the relationship between politicians and the press. I mean, this is a process that's been going on for quite some time, and I think what Nicky's book actually does is to foreground, is to bring into relief, how that relationship actually works. And it seems, what's come out of that, at least, is what it provokes for me, at least, is a discussion about what happens to something like what used to be called the popular press. And this term popular is actually really interesting here, and I don't mean popular in the sense of Lady Gaga is popular or something like that. I mean popular in the political sense as being about of the people. I mean this is what popular, and this is what the term actually means. And when it comes to things like news media, popular press would be something like a press that actually holds politicians and powerful people accountable for their particular role and position in society. And I don't think it's not going out on a limb to suggest that this is something that has kind of disappeared in recent times. And for me, Nicky's book puts that squarely back on the agenda. What would a popular press, what would it actually be? What would something that actually does call powerful people to account, what would that actually look like in the current context? Because of course what we're actually seeing, and I've actually written about media strategies from the Prime Minister, and the responses to Nicky's book, is a clear demonstration of precisely the disappearance of something like a popular press. The response is for politicians to actually try and manage the media. So what we saw with when the book was first released were a whole series of, I liken them to kind of buzzwords and phrases that turn up in focus groups and so on. So the Prime Minister said, for instance, that that the book contained baseless allegations. I think was one of the terms. The other term was the other repeated term, and it's important that these terms actually get repeated, is that Nicky was a sort of crazy left-wing conspiracy theorist. And that's the idea of a response to a very serious piece of work. So why does the PM actually do this? Well, but this is how politics actually works. This is how you manage the media. You operate in the same way that a TV commercial operates. So if you've watched a commercial for deodorant, what you'll notice is they repeat the term confidence a lot. And this is what the Prime Minister does, repeats the term the left-wing conspiracy theorist, baseless allegations and so on. So it's actually operating in the same way that a deodorant commercial would actually operate. The effects of that is that it's not interested in, you have a situation that isn't interested in opening up the issues, not interested in, talking about the nuances of particular things that actually matter to people. And for me, a book like Dirty Politics actually, reveals, or at least, in part, reveals the fact that the media machine has found it very difficult to cope with this. Is precisely an example of what I'm suggesting. And that's what I'm kind of interested in. So I'll throw to Rosemary. Thank you, Rosemary. Dr. Rosemary Overell.
Thanks, Brett. I guess building on some of the stuff you were talking about around the type of sloganeering and sort of buzzword mode of discourse, I mean, this suits very much the kind of blogosphere and social networking mediated type of politics, which is really quite associated with this idea of scandal, which I found quite interesting. I mean, I've written about scandal in terms of pop singers and gender and things like that, but it operates in a similar way around politicians. We have, obviously the topic of Nicky's book is about people searching for scandal as a way to take down or ruin people's political careers, I guess, and that this has become I mean, it's not new that people, the public has sort of, is scandalised by political activity, but it is perhaps new that this is sort of the default mode of engaging with political issues, this idea that everything has to be sort of operating at this hyperbolic, scandalised, hashtag politics type of level. And it's also interesting as well because at the same time the sort of denouncing of Nicky as a left-wing conspiracy theorist is sort of trying to operate in that same mode of making him a figure of scandal as well, in a way to sort of silence and curtail the debate. And I think the big problem for me with this politics of scandal, again operating mainly through social media, is that it perhaps positions people, and Nicky sort of spoke to this with Bryce earlier, as almost resigned to politics being scandalous, and therefore there's no point in engaging with it. And that's probably the most dangerous part of the ascent of this type of soundbite scandal politics, because people will sort of switch off and perhaps not vote or not want to participate in, I guess, the processes such as voting. Anyway, Holly's going to elaborate a bit on these ideas.
Thanks, Rosie. Well, what I'd like to talk about in relation to the way that scandal might operate in relation to media and politics is the way in which the media or the news media is structured around a kind of proliferation of information at the same time as there's a superficiality of information. And so if we look at old media or traditional media in terms of broadcast, cable television news and print newspapers, we have a system that I would argue is very difficult for independent or alternative viewpoints to have a platform within these mediums. And this is because in some ways, and perhaps we can talk about this, traditional news media doesn't really have a platform it doesn't lend itself to discussing political issues in complexity or diversity. It exists simply to comment on issues as they unfold. And there are also obviously patterns of ownership as well that lock out independent or alternative viewpoints. And then with the rise of convergence or digitisation, you have a merging of old media and new media, in the sense that news outlets are offering content through a different range of platforms. So you do have the integration of blogging or new forms of media within old forms of media. And what this has done, in some ways, and we might talk about this as well, is blurred the lines between a news audience as a citizen, a democratic citizen who needs to be informed about political issues so that they can better participate in the political process, a blurring of that conception of the audience as a citizen with the conception of the audience as a consumer who wants news on demand and they want to access it through a whole range of platforms however they can. So in some ways this has led to news organisations cultivating news consumers as citizen journalists. So you'll if you've gone online and you look at online news, you'll note that they often have an invitation for audiences to send in a photo or a video of an event that's unfolding. So there are structures in which old media or traditional media do encourage a kind of citizen journalism. But what's kind of different or what's interesting about the way in which blogging or blogging's relationship to news media is that they're often positioned by old media and they often position themselves as being partisan or biased from the very beginning. So they're not operating from this idea that they're a news outlet and they're offering objective information. So, for example, you have whale oil frequently described as a right-wing blog in news coverage of Nicky's book, and then as Brett mentioned, one of the strategies of the National Party has been to discredit Nicky's reporting as quote, a screaming left-wing conspiracy theorist. So there's this distinction between a kind of proper or authentic news reporting and the positioning of independent bloggers and reporters as partisan or biased, and this is the basis from which this information can then be discredited. And so this model of convergence, where you have a seemingly consumer or market-driven imperative to disseminate news across different platforms, doesn't necessarily diversify the types of sources or reporting. and it means that when political issues or politics are reported in the media, I would argue alongside with Rosemary, they're reported on through the logic of scandal or dirt. That's the only way that these types of issues can reach some kind of push through into mainstream or traditional media. And I guess there's a couple of points that we've been talking about here, which is that the idea that politicians' relationship to the media has changed to one of, instead of the politicians fronting up and talking to the media as a public good to discuss policy, it becomes about management. And Nicky mentioned this before, it's the idea of continuous impression management. And then from the media's role, it's also because of a 24-hour news cycle and the need to kind of have a lot of information out there that at the same time, I don't think that necessarily diversifies news. It leads to superficiality. So maybe we could talk about one of those two things, the changing relationship of politicians to the media.
Yeah, well, I'll also bring up something else because I think it's implicit in some of the things you're saying, which is around networks. I mean, networks have always existed. There's nothing new about networks, and political networks in particular have been absolutely central to how power is shifted and shaped. But I think one of the things that's really interesting at the moment is that social media networks and electronic networks have changed both the rules of engagement, but also it's possible now to see things in the way that networks function in a way that you couldn't do before. So one of the interesting things out of the book has been that quite a lot of the networks have been revealed. You can follow the emails, you can look at who was targeted on Facebook, you can see the posts and the string of posts. You can also then track all the other backstage efforts to try and conceal who's talking to who and what they're talking to them about. And that, of course, is part of the management of public opinion. But at the same time, some of those things are now becoming to the foreground. So there are a lot of people who can now comment in a way that they couldn't do, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, because there were not social media. I mean, I could say, well, right at this moment, you know, there is a lot of commentary going on, which will be across Twitter, and with any luck, some of those might come back as questions to us, I don't know. But the point is, at the moment, that's actually quite invisible, unless you happen to be on your Twitter feed and can know about that. But there are these electronic forms of network which switch in and out, and which make things visible or invisible. And one of the things which I like about the book is the fact that it makes some of those things visible and therefore enhances democratic participation.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, I see the book as belonging to, this a new emergence of, I mean, you called it a whistleblower before. I actually like that idea, even though there's a history of, the relationship between journalists and whistleblowers. What's kind of new about today is with things like, WikiLeaks and the Edward Snowden leaks and so on, is actually, well, it seems to me these are the only guys that are actually doing anything interesting, and I'd put Nicky Hager in the same kind of category. I mean, this is where what I was talking about before, the idea of a popular press actually comes to the fore. This is the situation. These are the people that are actually calling powerful people to account. Here's what they're up to. This is what they say on camera, but actually this is what they're doing, over here. So that's, these are the guys that are actually doing something interesting. And it seems to me, the rest of the press has to kind of catch up with that, or it has to situate itself in relationship to that. Either it supports that, or it challenges that in some particular way. I don't know what you guys think.
Well, I thought it was interesting just thinking about John's use of that word networks, that I agree. It also, with social media, there is an enabling of a type of public sphere discussion, and certainly a lot of the Twitter discussion around the hashtag dirty politics has been quite insightful. However, I guess Nicky's book also draws out the relationship between right-wing blogger Cameron Slater and the mainstream media. So there's also this network that he uncovers of links, but explicit links, or not explicit, but links between the blogger and the politicians, but also how mainstream media can pick up some of these sound bites that people like Slater use, and then sort of, I guess, validate them by putting them in mainstream news, like taking them off the right-wing fringe and validating them by publishing them in so-called, normal news outlets.
Why don't you reckon it's kind of curious how blogs are referred to as left-wing or right-wing, whereas the conventional press, as we know it, don't want to be associated with any kind of political view, not kind of overtly at least. We might, read their articles and divine that they might be... why do you think blogs are kind of assigned like that, left-wing, right-wing? Why is everybody comfortable using left-wing, right-wing when it comes to blogs, but they aren't with the mainstream press? To me, I think that's a positive thing. I think I disagree with Nicky that the issue isn't about left and right. Actually, the point is, I don't believe that anybody can be objective about anything. You've got to have to put your cards on the table and say, this is the perspective that I write from, and that's what a popular press would actually do. It doesn't write from a vacuum. It writes from a set of presuppositions about how we think culture and society works. So, I don't mind the idea of the blogosphere being called left and right wing. I don't know what you guys think.
But do you think that's some way of constructing a division between an authentic, traditional sort of press that's seemingly objective? Don't you think that's why these terms like right-wing or left-wing blog are kind of thrown around? Because, I agree with you. I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that news is produced from a partial position, because at least then there's some honesty about your motivations for producing news. But I think that the way in which the left-wing blog or right-wing blog, to me it seems like that's one way in which a division is constructed between what counts as legitimate news and what counts as illegitimate news.
Sure.
I think there's a couple of things I'd want to say. I think the idea of the blogosphere actually can go right back to the idea of broadsheets, but back in the 1700s. They're really no different. They're just a different form of pamphleteering, if you like, but they just happen to be electronic forms of pamphleteering. So I think that's probably the first point I want to make. And probably back in those days, although I'm not absolutely sure about this, they probably were either deemed left or right. Probably Whig and Tory in those days, but the same kind of thing. But the second point, which comes back to what you're just saying, I think, is to remind me that of watching Campbell live, I think, last week, when he did a programme about the non-appearance of Jerry Brownlee at the 4th commemoration of the Christchurch earthquakes. And the point about that was that he then went on to say, they have refused to turn up to this, and we have been trying to get government ministers, and I think he named, I can't remember what the number was, but it was something like 160 requests had gone out over the past 3 years. The point he made out of that was that here we are, a mainstream media, who are trying to create balance, and we are attacked because we can't create balance. Now, the notion of balance is, if you like, an ideologically constructed one, or it's a professional one, which is part of the professional identity of journalists. The point I'm making here, though, is that he was arguing that because the government would often not turn up to things, they couldn't find somebody else to take their place, so they were accused of not being balanced. So their professional identity was itself under attack because they couldn't get that kind of balance within their own professional production strategies. So in a way, that's a different response to what you're saying, but that would be moving away from the blogosphere, I guess.
I'm interested, though, about this idea of appearing in real life as well, because there's also this shift to politicians having a mediated profile, of having a Twitter account, and that also speaks to Nicky Hager's idea of the two-track politics. So we become John Key's friend by following his Twitter feed, this sense of intimacy we have with politicians through SNS. And I don't know, I find that interesting. So there's this kind of use of SNS or to do takedowns, but also to build that top track of being relaxed and comfortable and everyday schmo. Just quickly, obviously I'm from Australia, but this is certainly something that's been used to great effect by people like Kevin Rudd. He tweets about his breakfast or Father's Day, these kinds of banalities that all work to sort of make you feel a chum of the politician as well.
So I guess this is the slippage between the politician as celebrity and the politician as a elected representative of the people, and then I guess a journalist is in a position as to whether or not they choose to favour either of those particular positions, or in the case of the way of a carefully managed media profile like the PM, you're only ever looking through, that celebrity kind of image that he kind of projects. The smile, wave, and deflect, and never actually debate any issues because he's too nice a guy to be controversial kind of image, and so that backs that up. So that kind of gets in the way of any sort of debate or exploring the nuances of an issue, which I think what Nicky was saying before. Yeah. But for me, I'm really interested in Nicky's point about the closing down of democracy, and it gets back to the role of the press or the news media in promoting democracy, being a site, a kind of public sphere for that to actually happen. And I think it wouldn't be too much of a limb to argue that contemporary politics and politicians seem to spend most of their time not interested in making society more democratic. They don't seem to be committed to democratic processes, apart from, you go and you vote once every 3 years or something like that, and that's about it. But, when's the last time you heard a politician say we need to actually make society more democratic?
It's interesting because it reminds me of watching on Māori television. They have, which they've done every year as far back as I can remember, they have the 4 candidates from a particular region who will stand up and they will present, they do a traditional old-fashioned debate. And there's something very nice about just being able to watch people discussing and disagreeing about their different points of view with some evidence put in front of them and the way that they respond to that. And that's so unusual these days because there are none of those street corner meetings, there are a few town hall meetings, there's none of any of that. Everything now is mediatised in a way that simply didn't used to be the case, in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this could go back to this idea of scandal as well, that it's so we're so used to being scandalised that there's a resignation to actually go out and deal with it in real life. There's a modality of just retweeting or, doing a tweet about something rather than getting out there and getting actively involved. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, isn't there an argument around it that the way that user media and other forms of media actually operate is to actually make people feel like they can't do anything?
Yeah, a resignation, right?
Yeah. Right. That there's, they're not actually providing avenues and locations and spaces for people to be able to, discuss issues, or at least for them to be taken seriously.
But again, this comes back to the issue of media management. So that makes me think about, for example, the last American election and some of the tools which were used by the Obama campaign, which was to use big data and algorithms, so that they knew perfectly well that there were certain kinds of people who, if they didn't respond immediately to an invitation to take part in a poll or something like that, were not worth approaching again. So those people were categorised in particular ways, and it shaped the way that people were approached or not approached in ways that the public, as a public, were totally unaware of. And yet that was part of the strategies that were used by the Obama campaign to get itself re-elected. And that's not particular to Obama, of course, and the likelihood is that those kinds of techniques, which we may or may not be aware of, will be used within the New Zealand context as well.
Oh, sure, yeah. Holly?
Yeah, I suppose it kind of comes back to some of the points that I was mentioning before, in the sense that the way in which politics becomes mediatised is also linked to particular kinds of legitimacy as well. So I think the strategies that you were talking about then, John, in terms of how people choose to participate in the political process, and then on that basis of how they're choosing to participate, a campaign or political party will then tailor their approach to you. So it's about the mediatisation of politics, but it's also about the way in which mediatisation works to legitimate particular kinds of knowledges that get disseminated through the media. So where is the knowledge being produced from? Is it being produced through Twitter? Is it being produced through like a right-wing blog? Or is it being produced through traditional news? But I also think that it's about legitimating people's participation in the political process as well. So is it now more legitimate for people to participate in the political process through tweeting or retweeting? Right? Do we want to kind of reproduce the old school idea that you show up to a town hall and that was like the ideal form of political participation? It doesn't seem to me it's a question of whether prior to mediatisation, there was more engaged forms of political process. I think what we're seeing is just a legitimation of a particular kind of political participation through media and social media.
Well, you know, the thirst for public opinion and opinion polls, which personally, you know, I think opinion polls should be banned, you know, during electoral cycles. Because I think, you know, opinion polls actually lead the electorate, and you know, they actually don't tell us very much at all, really, objectively, about, you know, what's happening with the population. But this is a part of the mediatisation of elections and the electoral cycle. You know, the idea is you try and think of it as a sporting event, and you know, this particular party gained, you know, these gained, as if it's a horse race or something like that. This is absolutely the most ridiculous kind of set of data that you could produce about the social world, and yet so much pins on opinion polls, and then political parties alter their campaigns around, you know, how this actually works, and, you know, focus groups and things like that. You know, I think opinion polls and those data sets that are generated should be completely abandoned, and that what you should have is a space that's set up where, you know, people actually talk about the political issues. And so, you know, the electorate can, as a citizen, decide, here are the things that I'm interested in, rather than the press always wanting to be measuring everything every 10 minutes to see what everybody thinks. That's ridiculous.
Well, where do you see that desire for opinion polls coming from? Do you see that as coming from the electorate, or do you see that as coming from the politicians, or do you see that as being a media kind of driven phenomena?
I think it's because the press is so bereft of any capacity to be able to analyse anything politically. I mean, that's a very broad statement, I know, don't get me wrong. So there are pockets, but by and large, you know, they seem to be so bereft of actually really discussing the issues that they rely upon, you know, quick fire news, and it deals with, it helps them to handle things like news cycles. It's very cheap to do. You know, like good investigative journalism, like Nicky's, is a pretty costly kind of exercise for news organisations, and this is why, you know, we don't see as much of it anymore. It's precisely because, you know, it's expensive to do, and you know, that's why we should, you know, value good investigative work like Nicky's. But yeah, I think that's it. It has to do with the way that you know, the more for less mentality that's become a part of the press these days, that nobody has any time to analyse things. So there it is. Here's the news. You know, this party gained 2 points on the opinion poll today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to take up your point about investigative journalism, I mean, as somebody who has both taught and trained journalists over a long period of time, one of the things that I'm aware of is that it's actually a complex thing. It's not just the resourcing. The resourcing is absolutely crucial, and many news organisations don't have the resources to be able to put into digging consistently, which is why you get people like Nicky Hager, to some extent John Stevenson, and there are a few other people who it's easy to name, who have to go out on their own, who are often ending up as contractors or stringers or people who are just independent writers, because the resourcing to be able to follow a story through for a long period of time is just simply not there. And I have experience of that myself from having worked in news organisations directly. And you have to be able to give a long period of time, you have to let people out on a rope, and there's no necessary comeback. There may not actually be a story at the end of it, or you may not be able to prove it. And there are countless instances of that. That's one side of the picture, and I think that's kind of picking up what you were saying. The other side of the picture, I think, is about the journalistic mindset, which is that often the training of journalists, particularly in New Zealand, I can't speak so much about elsewhere, is one which is about routinization. It's about constantly making sure you've got your facts checked, that you appear objective, that you balance this side of the issue off against the other side of the issue. But investigative journalism is about a form of curiosity, which is differently configured, and it's both difficult to teach and also requires journalists to break out of a groupthink mentality, because it's better to work within a herd. You're less likely to get things wrong, and therefore, in order to be an investigative journalist, you have to be on the edge the whole time, and you're possibly going to risk your relationship with the journalists who are your colleagues, or the organisations within which you work. I think it makes it a very difficult place to be. So it's another reason which I applaud investigative journalism when it's good and it works the way that, in this case, I think that it does.
Shall we take questions now? You look like you've got quite a few there.
Yeah.
Yeah. You'd be happy to take questions?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. There has been a lot of questions coming in, both from the floor here in the studio and also via the social media. One comment I will make just before I switch to questions, though, Brett, is that your stance against opinion polls is shared by one Right Honourable Winston Peters. Wow. So there you go. Your vote can be for New Zealand first this election.
He does get some things right.
One comment that has come through, or several comments that have come through, is taking issue with this idea that politicians today are more disengaged, not interested in the town hall meetings and the corner meetings and door knocking and so on. And several of our commentators on Twitter have said, well, no, they're doing all that stuff as much as they ever were. But it doesn't seem to be noticed, or it doesn't seem to be as well attended anymore. What would your comment be on that?
Well, that's true. I mean, there certainly aren't the big town hall meetings back as they were in the days of Muldoon, for example, which used to get a lot of television attention. And usually were, there'd be eruptions and fights, and people would, there'd be displays that would take place at these things. So I think, in a sense, it's a kind of part of the argument we're making, which is that in the way that the campaign gets mediatized, a lot of that kind of day-to-day activity just gets dropped out of sight. No one even knows about it. It's difficult to find where those things are often taking place. You've got to know about them. But it doesn't appear on the national news. It doesn't even get into much of the blogosphere, as far as I'm aware. It's just erased to a large extent.
With the way in which the media, the mainstream media, the MSM as it gets cut down with the way in which it has changed, or that it is now currently covering politics, and this goes to the question about scandal that you were raising, to what extent do you think commercial pressures and the fact that that form of media is finding it just very hard to make money is driving that change in the way politics is considered?
I definitely think that's a major factor. I mean, the fact that the press in here is very much commercialised. I come from a country where there's a public broadcaster still on television. I'm not saying Australia's great, but we do have that option of a public broadcaster. Here you've got the press and the television is commercialised, and there's a sort of need to keep viewers watching, right? And these are viewers who are already kind of used to and positioned as used to being engaging with things on a scandalous level. This is partly due to the fact that this television and press cover celebrity scandals constantly. So the Miley thing's a good example of that. So Miley's twerking becomes a news item, and it's operating on, is she a good feminist or is she not? Lord, similar story, operating on this level of scandal. So we have, I guess, these juicy nuggets of information that the audience is constantly wanting refreshed. And this brings audience members in who will then watch the ads. So therefore, a lengthy, perhaps dull town hall type of debate is not going to bring in the ads, but sound bites like screaming left-wing conspiratorialist are going to, get hashtags and viewers, yeah.
In terms of the way in which the political figures try to manage the media. We heard one example of Jerry Brownlee, who's refusing to show up on Campbell Live, and despite the numerous attempts to get him. Is that acceptable for elected politicians to play this game, to have their media favourites that they go to, their media favourites that they refuse to engage with? Or should there be some sort of generic public requirement on politicians to basically front up whenever the media ask, whoever they are?
Absolutely. Of course. I mean, there's always a fraught relationship between politicians and the media. They both kind of, need each other in some respects, but it's a fraught, conflictual kind of relationship. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we go back to the idea of a popular press, which is supposed to be holding powerful people accountable on behalf of the people, then absolutely. And any politician who doesn't front up to answer questions adequately, should be voted out of office. I think there should actually be a requirement of politicians to actually answer questions properly for its constituency, rather than just manage it with.
Yeah, and let me add, I mean, I think there's an issue around celebrity politics again. I mean, who are the figures who we see all the time? I mean, it's John Key and it's David Cunliffe. I mean, there are a whole range of other people who don't really get very much exposure, and they deserve to have that exposure, partly to be able to show that they are adequate and they're representable, or because they're not. I mean, but the point is that if you don't get access to those figures, then you haven't served the political process.
Can I just say one thing there? You do get a lot of people like Winston Peters, though, because he's got soundbite sort of that kind of calibre. But also, Brett's point goes back to public broadcasting. If you had a public television channel, like you've got the radio, perhaps there would be an obligation for elected MPs to appear on it, because it's publicly funded and part of their remit should be to appear. So I guess that's a broader issue around asset sales and things, yeah.
Because there's a little bit of a vicious circle there, isn't there, where you say these folk who don't appear and answer questions should be voted out, but of course it's all part of a media strategy to make sure they don't get voted out. So,
sure.
Yeah.
But if the system was that everybody had to front up to answer questions, then they would.
Yes, quite right. With the growth of social media and with the growth of blogs and so on, in some ways there's more information out there than there ever was before. So anyone can have their view, anyone can put their view out there, and it can be read. Yet at the same time, it seems we've got a culture where there is this less interest in ideas, big questions and so on. That may be a huge issue that you may not be able to resolve here and now, but do you have thoughts on why?
My view is I think there's a difference between opinion and actually arguments about particular political positions. So everybody is always asked what their opinion about things is, whether you like this or whether you like that, because that can be easily quantified, and then we might say this is what the population thinks. So I think opinion is a different kind of thing to somebody saying, here's an argument, here's my viewpoint, and here's the reasons why I actually think that. So, that's how I'd respond to that. I think that, there's...
Yeah, and I think this is part of a larger issue and a larger set of debates, which is around public participation in lots of things outside of elections. The classic work is Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, which is about the disappearance of people, being on JCs and all sorts of small bodies. Now, whether in fact that's true or whether that's shifting, I think is a moot point, and it goes well beyond probably what we can answer here. But I think it is part of the question that you're raising. Sure.
I think there's also the way in which media industries structure audience attention as well, that has something to do with the fact that while we have all these platforms that produce a proliferation of information, there might not be a depth of engagement that is necessary for the kind of political processes that you're talking about. So the New Zealand Herald, for example, sells itself to advertisers by saying that every time somebody visits our site, they visit for 3 minutes, which isn't necessarily that long to get a sense of world news or what's happening in New Zealand as well. So I think it's also about the particular kinds of structures that are in place in terms of how the media industry see the audience as engaging with news. And there's this the inverted pyramid model that we teach students when they write journalism, which is that you start with the most important information at the top, and then you drop the less important information to the end, because the idea is that if you have to write the story as if someone was only going to read the opening sentence of the story. So I think there's also kinds of structures within journalism in the way that news is produced that assumes, I don't know whether this is wrong or right, but that assumes that audiences are only going to pay the minimum amount of attention to the news that you produce. So I think there's also an issue there as well.
Going back to this issue of blogs being labelled left-wing and right-wing, and, one way to look at that is that they wear their colours on their sleeves, you know what you're buying yourself into. Is the problem, though, that the more that becomes the way in which political debate takes place, the easier it is to choose what you're going to hear? And so you only visit those blog sites that are going to essentially reaffirm your pre-existing prejudices. And if you do go to the other side, it's simply to be outraged by the latest thing that they've said that is completely ridiculous and should never accept. Where is there space there to find some way to bridge the medium, to find the kind of, engaged, informed debate that it seems that everyone wants, but we never can get?
I'll start, and the others probably have something to say. When you ask a question like that, I go back to the old Adam report, which no one probably much remembers these days, which was about putting programs on public television which were of dissimilar types, because it attracted audiences who wouldn't necessarily watch that program, but they were clashed up against something which they would watch. And so you had people who were constantly being exposed to stuff they wouldn't otherwise necessarily know about or even necessarily like. But in that exposure, they might want to. And that's the core philosophy behind public service broadcasting. So put that into the blogosphere, and what you have, again, is the sense of division all the time. Mm-hmm. I only need to read what I want to read. If I go on and use Flipboard, for example, on my iPad, well, I can just choose the stories I want to watch, and I don't have to look at anything else. That would be my part of the answer.
Well, I mean, the terms, left wing, right wing. I mean, in some respects, I kind of agree with Nicky that I think they're fairly empty at the end of the day. I mean, I think the point I would make is that there are, nobody writes out of a vacuum. So there has to be a perspective on something. There's a set of assumptions that need to be put on the table. Maybe the term left wing, right wing is a little bit old-fashioned. So something else should be invented. But certainly, the idea is that there are assumptions that are at play. I think that's what needs to be on the table. The idea of an objective set of facts or something about how societies work, I think I don't see how that holds.
But also, Brett mentioned before the algorithms which structure what we see, like the NZ Herald will prompt you with articles that are around your interest or what, I guess, slant you're taking, what you're clicking through. So it's actually built into the system that of online media that we will have perhaps a very sort of skewed, personalised type of news feed, if you will. Yeah.
Any last thoughts, Holly?
I guess I'd agree with Brett as well, in the sense that I think it's important to critique the notion of an objective news, or the idea that knowledge or information can be produced in a vacuum. We operate in a political system where political parties are partisan and they represent a particular set of issues, so we don't assume that they're bringing stuff to the table on the basis of not being biased. So I think it's okay to kind of engage with the media on the same basis as well.
Okay. We've now come to the end of our first panel discussion, so a last thanks to our panel members from the Otago's Department of Media, Film and Communications, Dr Rosemary Overell, Dr Holly Randell-Moon, Dr Brett Nicholls and Dr John Farnsworth. There'll now be a very short break in proceedings while we bring on our next panel members to discuss the political aspects to the Dirty Politics book. Thank you. welcome back. We turn now to our next panel, which will look at the political issues arising out of the Dirty Politics book. To do so, we have two members of Otago's academic staff, Dr Bryce Edwards from the Department of Politics and Professor Richard Jackson, Deputy Director and Director of Research at the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. They'll talk once again for about 40 minutes, at the end of which there will be the opportunity for questions to be put to them. So keep those coming in using Twitter @HagerDebate or #HagerDebate. First to speak will be Dr Bryce Edwards.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes probably, and then hand it over to Richard. But I will be watching on Twitter to see if anyone agrees with me, and I'll mention them. Otherwise, if anyone disagrees, I might try and answer your questions. But anyhow, I'm not really talking so much today about issues that arise out of Nicky Hager's book. I'm going to talk just a wee bit about some research that I've been doing already prior to his book coming out 2 weeks ago. And really in the first part of this year, I wanted to look at this idea that politics is getting more dirty already. So I've been amazed with Nicky's book coming out that has some similar aspects to some of my research. And I've certainly noticed since I've been following politics for the last couple of decades that elections are getting more aggressive, and that in all sorts of negative ways the politicians are working, and they are throwing around insults more than ever, and some particularly corrosive ones, which I'm going to look at soon. Terms like corruption are used a lot more by politicians than ever before. So really I'm trying to contextualise the Dirty Politics book and show how politicians have started to get more dirty a long time before this election, or a long time before even Cameron Slater was blogging. So I guess also I want to really show how scandal politics or scandal mongering has become this really important electoral weapon of politicians, and that we've seen some sort of escalation of fights between all the different politicians and different political actors. And if I get time before I hand it on to Richard, just to start talking about some of the what I think are the consequences of this increased scandal mongering. So I guess there's two main parts of scandal politics that I think we've seen in recent years in New Zealand politics, because traditionally we don't really do a lot of scandals in New Zealand politics. We tend to be, a bit more bland and boring than what we're experiencing at the moment. But what we've seen is a rise to a small extent of sex scandals, but much greater extent of fighting over issues of or allegations of corruption and integrity on the behalf of politicians. And so if you look at sex scandals, just to get that out of the way first, traditionally the media hasn't really reported on the private lives of politicians, and that's been quite significant. The families and what goes on in the bedrooms of politicians has always been seen as off limits for the media, and so there's been lots of examples whereby people like Muldoon was well known for being in promiscuous activities, heavy drinking. Likewise, David Lange was having an affair, we all know now, with Margaret Pope, his senior speechwriter, when he was Prime Minister. These weren't reported. The press gallery all knew about them, but there was this feeling that you don't report on those private lives. And but then that has started to change, and in more recent times the media is still a bit uncertain about where they go and what they can report, but they are a bit more inclined to go into those private lives, especially when they think that it's justified in terms of those private activities affecting their governance or their operations in politics, or if there's some sort of element of hypocrisy. And so more recently we're seeing things like the Len Brown affair, Darren Hughes scandal, Richard Worth, Graham Capel. There's all sorts of justifications for why those scandals have been publicised. And of course, coming back to the Len Brown one, it has a lot to do with new media and the fact that the mainstream media are catching up with what is thrown into the public arena by those that are using new technologies. But nonetheless, we have seen a bit more escalation of the politicians bringing those private lives into the public debate. So in Parliament, for instance, we do see the MPs, and we saw this around about 2005 with a lot more innuendo about Prime Minister Helen Clark's family life, about Don Brash's family life. And what's interesting here is normally politicians want to keep away from letting private scandals and even financial scandals come out to public light. And so the paper that I'm looking at tries to use the theory of nuclea detente in terms of domestic politics, with this idea that scandals haven't tended to come out in New Zealand politics because it's mainly been the sort of gentleman's agreement between especially Labour and National prior to the 1990s that they wouldn't launch allegations about the integrity or the way that politicians use their political finances and resources, because they knew that those same missiles would come back at them. So much like, during the Cold War, Russia was never going to send any nuclear missiles towards Washington because they knew that there would be a retaliation straight away. And according to the theory of nuclea detente, everyone was sort of safe because of that. So I've been trying to apply that to domestic politics and scandal, and showing how there's been a breakdown of that sort of gentleman's agreement, if you like, between Labour and National. And if I can just bring up there's a slide I think they're going to show on the live stream and up here on the screen, if Erica's got that, showing some research that I've been doing in terms of corruption in the media. I don't think it's come up yet. Is it up there? Yep. And that shows I've been looking at a media database that includes all the newspapers published in New Zealand and looking at how many articles use the word corrupt or corruption. And my discovery is that back in the early 1990s, hardly any articles used those words. We just didn't use that word in our debates. Politicians didn't use it, but it soon started escalating. And I don't know if you can see this on screen watching on the live stream, but you can see how it went up drastically in the 1990s after the new political parties came into the political system. And then after MMP came in, you had lots of different scandals, which I've tried to correlate with that graph. And there was an escalation. And basically, there was lots of retaliation that occurred after various different scandals came into public life. In particular, there was a major turning point around 1999, and this was the time that the Labour Party, who had been in opposition for 9 years, campaigned strongly on cleaning up politics. Some similar conversations that we're hearing today, in fact. And they campaigned on the Shipley government being full of political sleaze, lots of untoward activities going on, especially in government departments. The Auditor General during that time was actually jailed for corruption. This is the person in the public sector that is supposed to look after the government departments, make sure that they're not misusing resources, committing fraud, etc. He himself got jailed for a couple of years for fraud. And so people started asking questions about corruption in New Zealand society. And it became a really strong campaigning weapon of politicians. And all of them were calling each other corrupt. And that's basically when I think the nuclear button was pushed by the politicians. And all bets were off from that stage. There was an attempt to pull back at some stages in the early 1990s because all the parties don't want scandals breaking out and destroying everyone. But nonetheless, in 2005, there were two particularly landmark scandals. This was, of course, the Exclusive Brethren scandal that Nicky Hager dealt with in the earlier book, The Hollow Men, and that made lots of, or brought to light lots of details of collusion between a political party, National, and members of a particular church in ways that they'd tried to get around electoral laws. It brought into question how parties are using their money, how they're evading some of the electoral laws. After that, of course, we had Pledgegate, where it was discovered that it's obviously quite a long story, but that the Labour Party had misused their parliamentary budgets to electioneer, and the Auditor General came in, carried out an investigation and found that the Labour Party had illegally used, I think, nearly $500,000 of taxpayers' money on these election ads. But, of course, they discovered that all the parties had done it. And that legislation was passed to retrospectively make what was illegal legal. And from that stage onwards, finally all bets were off. And since then we've seen an escalation of scandal in New Zealand politics, where if you want to tarnish your opponent, the best way to do it is to bring up questions about the integrity of them, to accuse them of being corrupt. And basically, in the paper that I'm putting together, I'm trying to show how there's other important reasons for this. One, I think, is related to policy. And we keep coming back to this question in the current debate about a policy focus and a scandal focus, with these arguments that by paying too much attention to dirty politics, we aren't dealing with the policy and the important parts of the election. There's a lot of research to show that scandal politics actually has more resonance and is more talked about when there's less policy debate going on. So it's not necessarily the scandal politics crowding out policy debate, but it's the lack of policy differences that make people want to talk about some of the ways that abuse of power is carried out, etc. So certainly one of the explanations for the increase in scandal politics in the paper that I'm putting together is this idea that we're seeing a much greater policy convergence by all the main parties. And the more trouble that they have differentiating themselves against other parties, the more they focus on leadership and personalities, and they sell themselves on the basis of the attributes of the people involved. So, National sells themselves on the basis of John Key and his trustworthiness, his reliability, his competence, and the other parties do likewise. And the only way, or the most powerful way to try and bring down your opponent is to tarnish those things, because that's the main centre of election debate. And therefore, Labour will try and bring down John Key, or National will try and bring down David Cunliffe. So, in some ways, in my view, it's the politicians bringing scandal politics upon themselves. I think I'd better pass this on to Richard soon, because I could go on for a long time, but I guess I'll just finish off by just raising questions about scandal politics and whether it's a good thing for society, whether scandal mongering is intrinsically good or bad, and I certainly don't think it's good or bad. It's really a question of all dirt digging having a place in politics, and some will see that what people like Cameron Slater does is dirt digging. They'll see what Nicky Hager does is dirt digging. It's all trying to get behind the scenes of politics and bring to light what people want to hide. So some people say it's all the same, and Nicky Hager is just the same as Cameron Slater. And I think that's a really interesting question. Personally, it comes back to our own evaluations of this, and I think there's some quality scandals and there's some quality investigations, which in my view is what Nicky Hager does, and there's some that are repugnant, and there's obviously a spectrum between those two different things. So I wouldn't say we need less of scandal politics, we just need better quality scandals, which I think is what Nicky Hager has brought to us.
Great.
So I'll hand it on to you.
Okay, thanks. I think this is a really important book, and it's raised a whole heap of really crucial issues, which we've already been talking about, to do with the media, and as Bryce was talking about, to do with the sort of breakdown in the consensus that there were certain kinds of scandals that we would not put into the political debate. But what I want to talk about are three things that really struck me as I was reading Nicky's book, and which I think we ought to be really concerned about. And the first is the kind of degree of organisation and thought that's gone into trying to shift New Zealand politics to the right. It really struck me that that the people involved in this scandal and in these processes that Nicky has highlighted, have said that they've got like a 20-year plan to try and shift the political landscape to the right. and that they're determined to professionalise New Zealand politics in the same way that American politics is professionalised. And that is seen as some kind of ideal. And this is, you know, again, the sort of two-track approach, and the idea of using particular kinds of techniques to, in a long-term strategy, shift political opinion and shift political debate in one ideological direction towards greater and greater neoliberalism and a kind of right-wing extremism, really, where, you know, the market and market fundamentalism is the order of the day. And it kind of shocked me a little bit. And combined with that, the second thing was the sort of result of that and expression of that, and that is the role of corporate interests and the way in which they openly and deliberately and with purpose try to inject themselves through these backdoor processes into the public debate and into trying to shape policy. Now, when I read this, it reminded me of a study that I saw recently that's been conducted by Princeton and Northwestern universities called Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups and Average Citizens. And what the researchers did was they compared 1,800 different US policies that were put in place by politicians between 1981 and 2002. And they compared that to the type of policies that were preferred by, on the one hand, ordinary average citizens, and on the other hand, by wealthy Americans and special interest groups. And what they concluded from their research was that US policies are formed more by special interest groups than by politicians who represent the will of the general people. And their conclusion was, and I quote, "The central point that emerges from our research is that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on US government policy, while mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no independent influence." And they concluded as well that, and I quote, "When a majority of citizens disagrees with economic elites and or organized interests, they generally lose." And their argument was that America is no longer really a democracy, but an oligarchy. Now, what's worrying is that this type of politics and this kind of result is what these groups and processes are trying to engage in. And that should be very, very disturbing for all of us, I think. And that plays into the third sort of thing that struck me as I was reading this book, which is the rise, if you like, and the centrality of what we might call distraction politics. Politics that are based on pseudo-scandals and personality issues and trivial matters. And it really, really annoyed me and disturbed me that we're at a moment in history where we're facing some really terrible and pressing challenges that relate to the very way of life that we have and the political structures we have and the society that we have and the potential for the future. Global climate change, peak oil, the limits to growth, as well as all the pernicious effects of the growing gap between rich and poor, wealth inequality, and the levels of child poverty in New Zealand, for example. These are all such important issues, and yet most of the attention, most of the effort, most of the energy is going into this distraction politics. Now, the other thing that's disturbing about that is that that benefits no one except for the wealthy elite and the corporate interests, who can continue then in their own practices without any real challenge to that. Now, when I thought about this, I thought, we've got to ask the question, how did this happen? Or as Nicky raised the question earlier on, why is politics like this? Why is it like it is? Because obviously this hasn't come out of the blue. It's the result of developments over the years, and it's the result of a series of factors that exist in the environment. And I think there's sort of 5 key things here that, in a way, enable this kind of politics, make it possible. First is the professionalisation of politics, or the rise of a professional political class, whose interests then revolve around short-term electoral cycles. So they're not thinking 20, 30, 40 years down the track and what's best for society, but how to get elected. Within this professionalisation of politics, the importance of spin and polling becomes very crucial. So they have to maintain a high profile, they have to work the media, they have to spin and try and frame issues. Personality politics becomes important. So instead of arguments and visions and important ideological ideas and questions, it's all about who's got the best personality, who comes across well, who's charismatic. And in a sense, we've seen the burial of the service ethic amongst politicians. Politicians are not about service anymore, it's about a career. It's about how to forge a long-term career. And that involves short-term politics and spin and so on. There's also a second context to this, which is, as Nicky points out in the conclusion to the book, the sort of structures of politics around political campaigning rules and about the lack of strong checks and balances, public accountability processes. That also provides a context in which this kind of politics, this kind of dirty politics, can continue to occur unopposed, as it were. A third context is something that I've alluded to already, which is the wealth inequality and the access to power that provides. The concentrations of wealth in our society does have a political impact. And you can see it in the number of people who have direct access to politicians in the beehive and how many of them are lobbyists, for example. And that is a key issue. And I would say that if we did the Princeton study in New Zealand, we'd find a similar trend starting to emerge. That corporate interests now actually have more of an impact on policy than interests of people lower down in the power structure. I think a fourth context is the media, and I won't go into that because we've talked about that a lot, but changes to the structures and process of the media, particularly the 24-hour news cycle and the importance of polling and so on, is an issue. And then finally, I would argue that there have been important changes to the public. And what we have now is, if you like, a depoliticized, I hate to call them indifferent, but in a way, there's an indifferent public out there, an indifferent electorate. And that in itself, I think, is a result of decades of neoliberalism in which we've been encouraged to be consumers rather than citizens, and also a direct result of the political system itself, a political system which is based on a sort of commodified exchange. Vote for me, you give me your vote and I'll give you something back in return. I'll look after your interests in politics in some way. And I'm there for you. I'm going to try and respond to you, as if we were purchasing a product. And because we only do it every 3 years, we've got no real participation in between times as well. So there's a kind of vicious cycle that's gone on through things like mediatization, through all these other processes, through the political structures. We've now got an electorate that is sort of not as politically engaged as it should be. And the tragedy of all this is that, as I've said, we're facing such serious challenges. And we have to ask the question, is our political system and the kind of structures that we now have actually adequate for dealing with the challenges that we're facing? Can it actually seriously get to grips with inequality, wealth inequality, with climate change? Or do we need to think about seriously revamping the system or finding ways around it? I leave that as a provocative open question at the end.
Okay, well, perhaps we should go back to Andrew and see if he's got any questions from Twitter or any disagreement.
There's certainly been a range of comments coming in, both through Twitter and also from the floor in the studio. One question I'd ask of both of you is, we've heard talk of this politics of scandal, this idea that scandal has become much more of a way of doing politics, both from you, Bryce, but also from Rosemary in the previous panel. Is that what we're doing here today? Is this a part of the politics of scandal? Are we simply just another form of shock horror, look at bad things that these politicians are doing?
Of course we are. And I don't think that's something to apologise for. What we're trying to do, I guess, is make it more meaningful, because there is this great danger that if we just get concerned with the vileness of what's happening and blaming people or individuals or parties, then yeah, I think that is not helping us go anywhere. It's certainly the case that I don't believe we're going to get rid of scandal in politics anytime soon, and that people are looking at ways of cleaning up politics, and it's a good debate to have. How do we clean up politics? And although I'm what Nicky might say is one of the pessimists, and it probably is the case, so I'm not sure we can clean up politics, but there are some areas that I think would make a big difference. Improving the Official Information Act, applying the Official Information Act to Parliament would be a big start, and there's probably lots of other ways that we can democratise how politics is done. But in general, I think we're going to have to get used to scandals, and the public and commentators and the media have to become more mature in how we deal with allegations and scandals, and not take them at face value, because sometimes we're inclined to, and become better at evaluating them and working out, like I said before, which are the quality scandals and which are the ones to dismiss.
Richard, Bryce had a theory as to why scandal has become more prevalent, and that theory was this idea that in the old day, where there were two parties, both sides knew that they had skeletons in their closet, so no one went opening any closets, because otherwise their skeletons would end up falling out. Then with the introduction of MMP, all of a sudden you've got a whole lot more players on the scene, so that old boys, and primarily it was a boys' agreement, fell apart, and so now it's all open slather. He also then seemed to have a second reason why he thought the politics of scandal had got greater, which was this convergence thesis, that essentially as parties have grown more and more alike in terms of the policies that they're handing out or arguing for, there's less and less scope to argue there, so instead you argue for trying to undermine the other side. They're not as good, they're not as competent, etc., etc. Yet MMP seems to have delivered us a much more fractured and far more diverse selection of parties. You've got everything from ACT on the right through to Mana Internet on the left. So it seems that the introduction of MMP should actually pull against in that way. So do you think Bryce is right in his basic arguments?
I think to a certain degree. What's interesting to me is that if we take a historical view here, we have to factor in the end of the Cold War and the sort of death of ideology, if you like, where it was no longer possible to have this sort of strict left-right division, because the left was discredited apparently by the collapse of communism and socialism and so on. And at that point, we did see a kind of a convergence in ideological terms. Now, what I would argue is that the difference that you mention in our political system is actually not as great as people think it is. There's probably more that all the parties agree on than they disagree on. They all agree that that market capitalism is a generally good thing, and we ought to keep going with that. And they all generally agree on the sort of basics of the liberal democratic state and the role of government and so on and so forth. Where they disagree are on smaller policies. And to me, this is one of the key problems and one of the reasons why we've seen this type of politics is because this ideological convergence around the acceptance of the market, the acceptance of neoliberal capitalism as the only kind of way we can organise our system means that the basis on which you have to fight now is on more trivial issues. It's on presentation, it's on form rather than substance, it's on the way people come across, it's on personalities and scandals and so on and so forth. I mean, obviously this is not the only thing that's contributing to this. We've already talked about the media and the way in which the media operates now. The amount of transparency that there is out there and the way in which everything is electronically recorded, and you can never write an email without thinking first about how one day it may go into the public sphere, means that that old gentleman's agreement about scandals is no longer tenable anyway. But I would also argue that I think, and this is what Nicky is kind of trying to draw out here, is that there were key personalities involved, key agents, if you like, key people who have taken advantage of the system and really tried to exploit it and tried to create a new kind of politics, a new kind of dirty politics, and try to exploit what's happened for certain interests. And in many ways, all these factors have come together, and I would argue that they've kind of changed the culture of politics. You know, every institution, like politics or media or whatever, has its own kind of culture. The values that it has, the kind of processes, the structures, and all of these things have changed a bit, and I think we've seen a change in political culture. And the worrying thing is, once a culture changes, it's very difficult to change it back or to change it in a better direction. Not impossible, but difficult.
That's a thesis that things are getting worse. So it's a thesis that in the past things were better, we've now taken a turn for the worse, and that's undesirable, and we should try to get back on track. A couple of years ago, I forget exactly when, Russell Norman made a speech where he said that the current regime is the worst we've had since Robert Muldoon. In fact, it's as bad as Robert Muldoon, and he was roundly vilified and, you know, said, you don't know what you're talking about. Are we now saying he's right? Are things now worse than they were in Muldoon's era?
I think there's some parallels there between when Muldoon was Prime Minister and he personally denigrated a lot of his opponents. And yes, it's certainly the case that politicians are much more inclined to denigrate and play on the personal failings of their opponents than they have since that time of Muldoon. So yeah, I think he's right.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree quite a lot here, and it goes back to my point about sort of, you know, an ideological homogenisation that we've seen. And I think that the number of sort of really diverse voices in politics has reduced. And the number of sort of social groups that once probably had a much more powerful voice in politics has disappeared. You know, with the sort of killing off of the union movement, well, no, it's not dead, but it's been severely injured since the 80s, in particular, means that they don't have as much influence as they used to. And other various parts of society also don't have that voice in there that they perhaps used to have. And this is the worrying thing, is that when you have, and this is what studies around the world, like Thomas Piketty's study on capitalism, and this Princeton study and others show, is that as wealth concentrates, the wealthy have more influence in politics. And there is an increasing, if you like, democratic deficit that occurs, so that ordinary people and social groups and communities have less and less direct input into the political system in order to be able to get their preferences, first of all, heard, but then acted upon. And so, to me, this is really, really terrible, and this is the way things are going, and that's why I think, you know, we're soon reaching, I don't know if crisis is the right word, but we're soon reaching a point where it will be very important to sort of grab back some democracy.
Could I just jump in there and come back to this Muldoon issue? Because, of course, in some ways, comparing modern politicians and Muldoon is ridiculous, but there's the parallel in which Muldoon was quite aggressive towards the media. And that's what we're seeing also in contemporary times, that whether it's Nicky Hager, whether it's other investigative journalists such as John Stevenson, we've got politicians that really go for them and try and discredit them, defame them, I think. And that's the connection that I'm particularly thinking about with Muldoon. But, I mean, there's other parts of, it's not just, I think, national that's doing this sort of thing. I mean, I can talk about my own experiences that relate to some of the suppression we see in Nicky Hager's book. You know, I write a column for the New Zealand Herald, and after I'd written a somewhat critical column about one political party, a spin doctor from that party, and it wasn't national, rang up and said, "We're going to destroy you." we're going to get you off television, we're going to go to the press gallery and make sure that no one talks to you anymore. And that was serious.
How'd that work out?
It didn't. They couldn't come through with it, I don't think.
But the
who
fact
knows?
that the threat was made.
The threats, yeah.
Right. A question that's come through on Twitter, which relates back to also the previous panel. The Dirty Politics book is talked about blogs and these weird and wonderful things which essentially break down to people writing things on the internet. Mm-hmm. How many people actually read blogs? Do we know? Do we have any statistics on just exactly how many people are reading? It doesn't matter. Why do blogs count? Why do they
blogs
matter?
count because it's not necessarily the metrics, and it's probably some of the bigger blogs, Kiwi Blog, Whale Oil, Daily Blogger, probably the equivalent of a small daily paper in the provinces. But it's the people who are reading them. They do have an impact. And we can see from Nicky's book that, the messages that are filtered out in some of the main blogs do end up influencing the elite. They are opinion formers. So what you read in Kiwi Blog, Whale Oil, the Daily Blog, does actually filter through to the public. Mm-hmm. Through the mainstream media. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I think blogs are quite important. Thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes more on the really popular blogs. I have a blog, and even when I'm never writing anything on there, I still get 200 or 300 people a week checking in on it. Because every blog has statistics, and the statistics are quite astounding about how many people click onto blogs.
Wish we had some basis to question whether all those statistics are accurate or not. But yes.
Well, yeah, but I think as Bryce says, the importance of this lies not simply in how many people are reading them, because often they're people from around the world, or often it's the same person who clicks on every day because they happen to like it. And they already agree with that opinion, and so they're self-selecting. But I think the importance of it, as shown by Nicky's book, is when an influential blog then becomes a kind of conduit into shaping and framing the particular narratives around stories in the mainstream media. And that is where its pernicious influence lies.
But at the same time, we have to be really careful, because although Dirty Politics, shines some light on some pernicious activities with the blogosphere, it's going to be, I'm really worried that the whole blogosphere is going to be tarnished with that brush. And in my mind, new technologies and social media is an incredibly democratising part of public life. And we need more bloggers, we need more people participating in social media and writing on Pundit, writing on their own blogs, because it's in some ways it's much more quality political analysis than what we see in the mainstream media, and it can feed into the mainstream media. And you don't have to be a wealthy baron to be able to put your views out there.
And I think that's exactly right, and I fully agree with that, but I think this is what comes back to the point that I made about an educated public. I think part of the problem is that decades of neoliberalism and consumerism and all those sorts of processes have shaped the way we think and the way we consume to such an extent that often people are going onto blogs without the kind of critical faculties to be able to recognise when they're being spun, when they're being manipulated into perceiving things in a particular way. And in a sense, there is a degree of personal responsibility that people have to take to say, well, I'm not just going to read one blog, I'm going to check it out against others, and I'm going to check it out against authoritative news sources around the world as well.
That is the answer. And in the end, I'm also worried that we're going to end up over-regulating blogs. So there's going to be a clampdown on new technologies and the blogosphere. And I'm not against having a debate, especially the Law Commission report that came out, which hopefully the panel will talk about next. I think was a really important conversation, but this idea of totally clamping down about who can be a blogger, I think is a dangerous idea.
So you're not in favour of a licensing requirement for blogs?
A voluntary one, I am.
Voluntary, very good. Well, that is something the next panel will be talking about, so it's definitely an issue we're going to come back to. New Zealand regularly comes top or near the top, first, second, maybe we drop down to a third occasionally, on Transparency International's Perceptions of Corruptions Index. And we always pat ourselves on the back of that and tell us, look, you know, how wonderful it is that we're so, you know, free from corruption. Yet, as you point out, Bryce, the word corruption has been thrown around so much more. Now, of course, we need to recognise that Transparency International is on reportage. It's what people think of New Zealand, rather than any other sort of metric. It's a perception of corruption, which may change given, you know, recent events and so on. One of the reasons, though, I think that New Zealand has done so well in its perception is because we have institutions that are widely seen to be neutral and fair and reasonably integrity and reasonably free from influence from the government of the day. Though, of course, if those institutions start to fail, then our reputation also fails. Is that something that you think we've seen become a greater risk of late?
I think we've got lots of different institutions that, yes, hold up the governance of society as a whole, and they're like columns, if you like, and that's how Transparency International look at things, that you've got all these institutions that are pillars, whether it's in civil society, like the media, political parties, the justice system, you know, the public sector, and yes, some of them have more integrity than others. I think there's a lot of questions to be raised about how healthy the media pillar is at the moment, and the political parties, how strong they are, because in my view they're quite weak. Political parties as institutions, they have a lot of power, but they're not really integrated into society like they used to be, and they're not democratically robust, and as Richard talked about before, in some ways they've become hollow institutions with that are populated by careerists or professionalised, you know, spin doctors and politicians. And that's one of the major failings of our current integrity system.
Yeah, and I would also argue that those sort of measures are very, very simplistic, and they don't sort of capture the way in which influence can be wielded in the kind of subtle ways that Nicky has brought out in his book. The way in which corporate interests, for example, manage to shape public perceptions and the perceptions of politicians and so on, and then in sort of indirect ways influence public policy and the practices of public institutions. And to me, this is where we need more research. Going back to your question to Nicky at the beginning about what should students be researching. I mean, to me, what we need is some much more rigorous research in New Zealand to say what really are the influences that are wielded by corporate interests and by the wealthy in this country, and is the system being shaped and being moved in a particular direction in a kind of subtle way that's not really that visible, but which occasionally gets brought out by people like Nicky in this book, that we really need to be concerned about. And do ordinary New Zealanders and their preferences have the kind of influence that they should in a democratic system? And I think, you know, that would give you a different sort of more nuanced picture than the simplistic, oh, we're really transparent.
This question of allowing people to see what's really going on, this idea that, you know, there are different levels that are happening in any sort of discussion and debate, and that people aren't really equipped to understand how the system's working. When that argument gets made, one of the responses that's always given back is, well, we need to be teaching civics. That the real problem is that we get people who are coming out of the schools, they don't really understand how the basic system of government works, so how on earth can they be expected to understand the nuances of it? And teaching civics seems to be the answer to everything. The Constitutional Advisory Panel, when it released its report, the one thing it agreed on was we should teach civics in school, and so on and so on. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not opposed to civics being taught, but I certainly don't see it as any silver bullet. And obviously the motivation is a good thing, that we need more debate and more education in civil society about how politics works. But I think you also have to be very careful with bringing in education about politics into the schooling system. And, you know, where it happens in some countries, you know, it's called indoctrination. And so if civics just becomes about, learning to sing the national anthem and working out, being taught how government is great, I think that's a real danger.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree that there's no silver bullet here. Change has got to occur at a structural level. There's a whole series of sort of deeper structures that have to be sort of challenged and changed. You know, there's got to be sort of cultural changes as well. But this does touch on a really important point, which is teaching people how to be critically engaged, discerning citizens. And I think that, you know, maybe not civic education in the old-fashioned sense, but teaching people critical skills in media consumption, for example, how to be critical media consumers, critical skills in how to understand the nature of the political system and politics and the nature of the economic system, so that people can ask questions like, well, who does this policy really benefit? In being able to evaluate whether they support it or not. And teaching those kind of critical thinking skills would be very, very important for creating the kind of engaged, educated and politically oriented citizenship that could then actually have an impact on this whole process by not being bothered about consuming all the scandal. I mean, in a way, it's a vicious cycle because you have a population that buys all the magazines and watches all the shows and consumes all the scandals. And so then that's what the media continues to feed them, and that's what the politicians continue to feed the media. And it just becomes a circular thing. Once we stop buying those magazines and stop reading those blogs and read other blogs, we might change the process. My blog.
Yeah, my blog.
I think we can all agree that if everyone was more like us, the world would be a better place.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We can finish the symposium now. That's all that we need to know.
I think pretty much everyone would think that. So, given that that's not an option, that we're never all going to be like each other and never should be, how do we circuit break? How would you circuit break?
Do you want to go first?
No, you please.
Well, I think that there has to be some citizenship engagement, and I would, encourage people who are really concerned about this, and I think that there are a lot of people out there who are quite concerned about this, to form some lobby groups and form some campaigning groups to try and get the political rules changed. That would be the first thing. I would then also, encourage our media studies colleagues to teach critical media to their students so that we get a more educated and critically aware population. I think we really ought to make a stronger effort to hold politicians to account. And these days, politicians are quite sensitive to people actually like writing to them. And I think, if 100,000 people wrote to their politicians and said, shame on you for behaving in this way, that might have some kind of effect. Apart from that, I don't know. I think people have got to become more politically engaged, and that involves much more than simply voting once every 3 years. I think people need to find ways of expressing their political preferences and expressing their views and trying to build a better society that they believe in other ways, through local communities, through protest groups, through guerrilla gardening, through whatever, doing things out there, rather than just sort of being a consumer.
Bryce, any last comments?
I'm not sure I can add much more to that, except to say that there's a great tendency in New Zealand society and politics, whenever there's some dissatisfaction or disagreement about politics, to channel that energy and activism into parliamentary politics and into getting the state to do something. And the state's seen as the answer, or political parties are seen as the answer. There are lots of other ways of doing things beyond parliamentary politics. So that's my main contribution to it.
Well, thank you very much. We've now come to the end of our second panel discussion, so a last thanks to our panel members, Dr Bryce Edwards from the Department of Politics and Professor Richard Jackson from the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago. There'll now once again be a very short break in proceedings while we bring on our third and final panel to discuss the legal issues coming out of dirty politics. Thank you. We turn now to our last panel for the day, looking at the legal aspects coming out of the Dirty Politics book. To do so, we have Professor Paul Roth from the University of Otago's Faculty of Law and Professor Ursula Cheer from the University of Canterbury School of Law. They will again talk for about 40 minutes, at the end of which there'll be an opportunity for questions. So for the final time today, send them in via Twitter using the tag @HagerDebate or #HagerDebate. Our first speaker will be Professor Paul Roth.
Hi. Well, I'd like to talk about information law issues raised by the Dirty Politics book, and I'd like to focus on the other side of the conversation, which is not the political skullduggery on the right, but what others like Muriel Newman, former ACT deputy leader, saw as or sees as the elephant in the room, or what I would call the elephant in the legal room, which is Nicky Hager's use of material that was obtained from a hacker who acted unlawfully. Muriel Newman this week has written a piece in her online newsletter called Stealing an Election, and this week's poll on her newsletter asks, would you like to see Nicky Hager held to account for the part he has played in the criminal activity surrounding the stolen emails? This is not a leading question, of course, but Muriel Newman asks, how can it be that Nicky Hager can receive stolen goods and make a profit out of them by publishing them in his book without being charged by the police for the crime of receiving stolen property? She opines that Nicky Hager clearly is liable to up to 7 years imprisonment because of the value of this stolen property Now, as you know, we usually tell our students to avoid using the word clearly because this indicates that you might not be so sure. And so the short answer here is that in law, at least, emails are not considered generally to be property unless they contain something of intrinsic value, such as intellectual property, like a secret formula, a database, or copyrighted material. On their own, emails are just merely messages written in virtual reality, so they don't have any real existence as property for the purposes of the law. Where they do have some value or can provide the basis for some legal action is where the emails contain information. And so instead of using a property analysis, you have to use an information analysis when you're looking at possible legal liability that arises from the sending of email. And so if the issue is the misuse of information contained in emails, you really have to look at the common law and equity. For example, the law of contract, the law of copyright could be relevant in misuse of email information in some circumstances, but not here. There's no contract involved here, and there's no copyright issue arising. What we're dealing with mainly, as I understand, is simply email conversations and Facebook chats. So there's no copyright in that unless the conversation forms the basis of a script for, say, a movie or a TV show or maybe a dialogue in a novel. All of these are possibilities that I could foresee for this issue in the near future. But two legal issues that are quite plausible in this situation are misuse of confidential information and breach of privacy. So these are legal actions that do have legs. Not receiving stolen property. Forget about that one. So the first cause of action here is breach of confidence. And to make out an action for breach of confidence, the information has to have the necessary quality of confidence about it. It has to be communicated in circumstances that have a confidential vibe, if you will. And there has to be an unauthorized use of that information to the detriment of the party who communicated that information, whose confidence was violated, and I think it would be pretty straightforward to prove all of those elements in the present situation. So we come now to defenses, and there's a public interest defense where the information that has been communicated deals with a matter of legitimate public interest, as opposed to matters that simply the public might be interested in as a matter of scandal or titillation. So is this material in the book a matter of genuine public interest? Sometimes it's called, or aspects of this defense are called the iniquity rule. That is, there has to be some exposure of wrongdoing, something illegal, immoral, or just plain wrong. Another aspect of this public interest defense is where the individual whose confidence has been breached, have they courted publicity? So we're dealing with situations where the information disclosed is really a corrective to the projected image or a false image that has been presented, and the disclosure of confidential information is merely correcting information that's already out there. Probably one of the most famous cases in this area involved a case between Tom Jones and Engelbert Humperdinck versus their former press agent who wrote an expose book. And the English Court of Appeal said, well, that's fine for him to disclose all this information that he had received in confidence, because these pop stars had presented an image of themselves that was completely at odds to the reality, and the public had a right to know. So there are other cases along the same lines. So the public interest defense may well apply, but like so many other things in law, and that's why lawyers usually have jobs, nothing is black and white. It has to be slugged out. It's not an unambiguous answer here. The court's decision on these sort of cases the court's decisions are discretionary, but the discretion always has to be exercised in a principled way, which is to say they look at past cases to justify their approach. There are a number of factors that the courts will look at, such as the nature or weight of the public interest concerned. So there's an issue of proportionality between the public interest on the one hand versus the breach of confidence on the other. And frankly, publishing someone's emails and Facebook chats, it's a pretty big violation of people's privacy and their expectations of confidentiality of the conversation between the two parties. So there is a significant breach here, but the court would just have to look at whether the public interest in that breach was worthwhile, whether that could be justified. The court also looks at the nature of the breach. Was it seriously invasive? Were the details disclosed unnecessarily detailed? And I note from the book that in the introduction, Nicky Hager, expressly says, I'm avoiding any personal details, although there were a lot of them, and just sticking to the main issues. So there was a lot of probably personal information that was deliberately not included because it wasn't really relevant to the themes of the book. Another issue that the court looks at is to whom the information was disclosed. Sometimes the court says, well, the information shouldn't have been disclosed to the public at large. It was really none of their business. There's nothing they could have done about it. It should have been disclosed to the police or a regulator. In the present case, arguably, the public at large probably was the appropriate group to disclose this information to. Court also looks at the motives of the disclosure. Was it merely to make money, to sell newspapers, to make a news splash, or were there serious public service motives underlying this? And then finally, there are many other factors that the court looks at. These are just some of the main ones. Finally, breach of or misuse of confidential information involves the law of equity. It's an equitable remedy. And so the court actually sort of stands back and says, well, is it fair that we grant some sort of remedy? There are a number of maxims of equity, including he who seeks equity must do equity. If you're seeking equity, you must come with clean hands. I'm not going to say anything about Cameron Slater here, but you can make your own judgment measuring his conduct against that of these maxims. So breach of confidence is a definite runner here. I wouldn't say, it definitely would fall this way or that way. Ultimately, it's the discretion of the court. So all I can say is these are the factors that a court would consider. I would say Nicky Hager has a pretty good chance, but who knows? On the right day, maybe Cameron Slater might have a good chance as well. But that's basically the legal framework in which that would be determined. Secondly, there's a privacy tort that applies where publicity is given to private facts about someone where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy, and that publicity would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. By offensive here, I would think, if there were salacious details, if there was a real invasion of privacy. Again, it's up to a judge to decide whether the information in the book that's been disclosed would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. I know a number of people are offended by the way in which the information was obtained, but that's not the same thing. As with breach of confidence, there's a defense of legitimate public concern in the information. So that takes care pretty much of equitable and common law remedies. Thirdly, we come to the Privacy Act. And so the first issue under the Privacy Act would be whether Nicky Hager is a news agency engaged in news activities, because if he is, then the Privacy Act doesn't apply to him. There was a recent case in June involving, it was .com and the Attorney General, and the judge in that case took the view that a journalist who wrote a biography about Kim.com was an agency that was liable under the Privacy Act, because the Privacy Act was limited to articles and, the Privacy Act exemption was limited to articles and programs and didn't extend to books, even if books deal with current events and current newsworthy people, as everyone would agree .com is, and as everyone would agree Judith Collins and Cameron Slater are. But in that recent court case, the court's interpretation of the Privacy Act was not definitive because the issue didn't come before the High Court in a proper way. That is, it wasn't a determination under a Privacy Act proceeding. It was, by the way, in another type of proceeding. So what we're dealing with here is not, strictly speaking, a legal precedent. It might be persuasive to another court, but in and of itself, it's not legally binding as an interpretation of the Privacy Act. And also, the interpretation or the approach of the courts in New Zealand towards what is a news activity is quite wide in New Zealand. In fact, I think it's ridiculously wide. It covers, and the significance here is that if you're a news medium engaging in a news activity, you're not covered by the Privacy Act. You're immune from it. So what's covered, for example, under the news activity exemption has been the Target program on TV, which is, reports about consumer ripoffs and tradespeople sniffing people's underwear while they're not at home. That's a news activity. The National Business Review Rich List, that's a news activity. And so is a letter to the editor of the New Zealand Beekeeper magazine. So if all of these are news activities, I can't see why a book on current events like Nicky Hager's book shouldn't be a news activity as well. So there's clearly some legal ground to stake out here if the issue ever came to be determined. Ironically, Cameron Slater is currently locked in a Privacy Act case himself in relation to his stories about the businessman Matt Blomfield. And that information was sourced from Mr. Blomfield's hard drive, and he's trying to use the news activity exemption himself as a blogger. So if Nicky Hager is not a news medium carrying out a news activity under the Privacy Act, then we proceed to Principle 11. He's disclosed information, personal information, about other people, and there doesn't seem to be a relevant exemption under Principle 11. So what you go to next is the savings provision in the Privacy Act, which is Section 7. That subjects the Privacy Act to any other law that authorizes the disclosure of personal information. That brings us to the New Zealand Bill of Rights, which says that everyone's got the right to freedom of expression, subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law, as can be reasonably justified in a free and democratic society. And that in turn brings us back to breach of confidence, breach of privacy, and their public interest exemptions. So through all three of these avenues, we pretty much have the same legal approach that's applicable. If Nicky Hager is nailed under the Privacy Act, he can always, as a last-ditch effort, he can always rely on Section 85 for some sort of mitigation in remedies awarded against him, because Section 85(4) says that the tribunal shall take the conduct of the defendant into account in deciding what, if any, remedy to grant. So you would ask, is Nicky Hager, did he act maliciously? Was he earnest in his beliefs about the publication for the public good? It was, a positive thing, at least, that he left out personal life details. So all of these elements, even if he was nailed under the Privacy Act, would act by way of mitigation. So that's basically an outline of the sort of legal issues that we would be dealing with. Standing back from the whole affairs, I think it's got to be asked, would this information have got out otherwise than through publication of this book, even though it involves the publication of Facebook chats and email conversations? So if the answer to that is no, this information would not have come out otherwise, then you'd have to ask, or a court would have to ask, is this information the New Zealand public should know about? And I think, this is what it all boils down to in the end. And now I'll pass off to Ursula.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Andrew. When Andrew asked me to take part in this panel from a media law point of view, I was thinking about, what does this book give rise to? What are the issues that are important and I need to talk about? And apart from privacy and confidentiality, which were fairly obvious ones, I thought, what about looking ahead to the future? And what sort of maybe changes to the law might be signalled or should need to be discussed from all this? And so I want to talk about two things today. And the first is the possibility of regulation. And Bryce raised the issue of worrying about blogs being regulated or crushed or controlled or licensed, and I can certainly talk about that shortly. I think, first of all, I can say right away that's not going to happen. It's highly, highly unlikely. So I want to talk about this report here, this big thick tome on my knee, which is a report that was issued by the Law Commission 2 years ago, and it looked into this very issue of how should the media be regulated in a new way of some kind that draws in new media as well as mainstream media. So the Law Commission spent a long time looking at this and very comprehensively reported on it. And I want to talk about in particular the definition they came up with as to how we would define journalists and news media in a way that would allow us to recognise when they should have the privileges that go with that. And the second thing I'll just mention in finishing is the harmful digital communications bill, which is currently in Parliament. It's come back after it's been through select committee. It hasn't had its second reading yet, and I want to talk about the possible impact of that if and when it's eventually passed. So turning first to this report, the News Media Meets New Media, I can't do any better really than to read from it, and I hope you'll forgive me. I'm not going to read screeds, I'm just going to read a little bit. But the Law Commission, as is their wont, look very closely at the history of media. They go right back to the beginning and look very comprehensively as to how we got to where we are now. And what they talk about generally in relation to that is mass circulation newspapers and broadcast media equivalents led to this new political force public opinion, which I think's been mentioned by our other panellists today, and this was to have a profound effect on how governments behaved and how democratic institutions evolved over the 170 years or so since the early 19th century. So then the Law Commission identifies that throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries, this idea developed that the press has had an important role to play in the democratic process that took hold, and this became a central plank in the defence of an independent and a free press. And this led to an individual's fundamental right to freedom of expression becoming conflated with the idea of freedom of the press. You often see those two ideas pushed together or dealt with in the same breath. So we're talking about a commercial press here, but nonetheless this whole background led to the idea or an expectation that even this commercial press is going to be accountable in some way to the public, and that they've got this quasi-constitutional function that they're carrying out, and that's with us now, and the laws and any ideas of regulation are based on this idea. So the Law Commission goes on to say, they talk about the special position of the press leading to special freedoms that they had, freedoms and privileges. And in New Zealand, there are things like the right to be in court and report on our behalf, being the eyes and ears of the public, and the right to be there even when everyone else has been shooed out. The exemption under the Privacy Act that Paul's just been talking about. And there are many more of these. The right now in the, or privilege as we should call it, in the Evidence Act for journalists not to disclose their sources unless it's absolutely necessary in the interests of justice. So these are privileges that have been given to the press, journalists, the news media, and developed over time in order to perform that very important public function for us. So the point where we get to now is that these freedoms that the press have are matched by responsibilities, and foremost amongst these, and these are mostly built into the codes that journalists have, and I think someone earlier today in one of the panels talked about this being part of a journalist's professional image. Now, to me, it's more than that. It's part of the law because it's in codes and it's in our forms of regulation as well. So it's not just about how we think of journalists and how they should be. It goes much deeper than that in a regulatory sense. So we're talking here about the public being able to rely on truthfulness, accuracy, fact and opinion being clearly differentiated. You're not stopped from exercising the right to have an opinion. If you're still news media, we've got plenty of political columnists, there's plenty of opinion in the news. It's not just out there in blogging land. So those rights are very important, but there has to be transparency around that it is clearly delineated so the public know what's actually happening. The public needing to be confident that the news media is not going to use its considerable power and influence to deliberately mislead or to cause unjustifiable harms. And I really like the way the Law Commission's described that next. They say, in crude terms, this describes the social contract that's understood to exist between mainstream news media and the public that it's serving, and on whom it's as well relied for commercial success, obviously. Now, what the Law Commission used this discussion for then was to try and develop a definition of the news media which would take in new media. And their idea was that we've got a number of statutes, the Privacy Act being one, the Evidence Act being another, where there are definitions of news media, and that entitles them to those special freedoms that I've been talking about. And the Law Commission was trying to draw this all together, as they're quite good at doing that. They tidy the law and make it accessible, and their reports generally are aimed at making the law work better for everybody and being more accessible and more easy to understand. So their idea was we should have one definition in all our statutes in New Zealand, wherever we're talking about media. And the first decision they had to make was, well, should this include new media? And they decided, after looking at the matter for 2 years, seeking input, they consulted, they received submissions from the public, and for a Law Commission report they got quite a good number of submissions on this. David Farrar submitted, other bloggers submitted, they interviewed Cameron Slater. So they looked at the new media landscape and tried to take account of that and consult properly and hear what everybody had to say. And of course the media made submissions and so on as well. And so at the end of the day, they came up with a definition that they thought would do the job. And I'll tell you what was in that. I'll read this because I want to be accurate about it, if you'll excuse me. So, a statutory definition of news media. They said the statutory exemptions and privileges we've been talking about would be met if any entity or individual meets the following criteria. So they've got a set of 4 criteria here. A significant element of their publishing activities involves the generation or aggregation of news, information or opinion of current value. Secondly, they disseminate this information to a public audience. Thirdly, the publication's regular and not occasional. And fourthly, the publisher is accountable to a code of ethics and a complaints process. So they've got a kind of description of, what news media would look like, and then they've got a kind of an added requirement or condition of being accountable to a code of ethics and a complaints process. And the idea was to encourage regulation in this way, to invite new media into the stable. And as long as they met this definition and also were accountable to a code of ethics and a complaints process, then in return they would be entitled to be recognised as news media generally. But they weren't mandating that in a statute, but the point was that any statutes that gave media privileges and those special freedoms we've been talking about would allow new media to have those as well. And looking back at this definition now, of course this was all before the publication of Dirty Politics and the information that's in there about the behaviour of certain blogs. I think this definition has got something missing, and I think more thinking needs to be put into this idea of what is news media and what is a journalist. And I think there's more to it. There must be more to it than just churning out news, just getting news from somewhere and churning it out. It's all well and good that you might be accountable to a code of ethics and a complaints process, but if your stories are being fed to you and you are publishing them for your own reasons that may or may not be malicious, may or may not be political, and or you are being paid to place those stories and you have an outlet to do that, then you're, and to my mind, not news media. You're either a public relations consultant, you're a communications consultant, or you're a blogger who has a very bias one way or another way. You may even be a toxic blogger. You may be extremely malicious and you may be attacking people and being extremely harmful to them. So this definition, I think, was an attempt to invite new media in, but I don't think it took account of this extra element, which I think Nicky's book has raised and I think needs more thinking. And I would like this report, it actually recommended an overarching new regulator for all media, including new media, but it was going to be a voluntary type of regulator. So you didn't have to belong, you could still sit outside it if you wanted. And the government, in the same year that this report came out, declined to implement this report. So nothing's happened as a result of this report. There's been no decision to implement that definition, to change the definitions in the statutes or anything of that kind. And I think this could be revisited. I would like it to be revisited, not necessarily in relation to a new regulatory scheme. In fact, the press don't want that and are not sure about that. But in terms of getting a clearer definition around what news media is or what journalists are, I think that's a good idea. And it would be good, for example, if whichever government gets in after the election, perhaps sends this back to the Law Commission to have another look at, or someone in opposition could sponsor a private member's bill. There would be ways of getting this possibly into the House to be looked at again. And the reason I say that, and the reason that I think a definition of that kind needs looking at again is, and this was raised at the time that the report was prepared and submissions were taken, a number of media and others raised the issue about the dilution of media's legitimacy, and that's what I see Nicky's book as very much pointing up and raising the spectre of the loss of the news in the way, the loss of the news into forms of new media that are no longer either regulated or no longer but obey those rules of that social contract that I talked about at the start. So this is one possibility. It's not law yet, but there is a possibility that that could be looked at again. And the idea would be then that you have bloggers who want to be seen as media in that way, as long as they meet those requirements. It's a good thing, of course, if they set up codes of conduct and have ethical systems to deal with complaints, or if we don't get a new system of overarching regulation, of course they can apply to join the Press Council or the Broadcasting Standards Authority, or now the Online Media Standards Authority. Now, my understanding is that Cameron Slater has in fact applied to join both of those, and nothing's come of that as far as I know. And David Farrar, I understand now, has said that he will sign up to one of those bodies. So we see a move by one of those bloggers mentioned in Nicky's book to, there are other things that David Farrar has said now that he will do, such as becoming more transparent and declaring where his funding comes from and things like that. So you see there some moving into a more regulatory situation of at least one of the blogs mentioned in the book. What happens about blogs that are right out there and don't change and don't become transparent and don't become more ethical and upfront about what they're actually doing, and they're actually causing serious harm to people from publishing material? This is where I want to mention the Harmful Digital Communications Bill. This is a bit of a... we're not sure where this is going to go, this bill, just quite what its effect will be and quite how effective it will be. It was originally intended to deal with cyberbullying. And in fact, it was part of this report. The Law Commission was asked to look at cyberbullying specifically in the second part of this report. And what happened was Judith Collins lifted out the last part of the report and said, well, we're going to implement cyberbullying regulation, but we're not going to implement anything else about regulation of the press generally. Of course, that was a highly attractive policy to follow and a highly attractive new sort of law reform to bring in. And that's why the bill has got as far as it has in terms of the parliamentary process at the moment. I would think no matter what happens at the election, either government, whoever the government was, will probably pass this. You'd agree with that, Paul?
Yeah.
And this, I like the approach in the bill in the sense that it is designed to be accessible and reasonably easy to use. It's based on a model a bit like the Privacy Commissioner's Office. It's based on a set of digital communications principles. And then you have a first step where someone who has suffered serious harm from something that's been published about them online, digitally, can complain to an agency. Now, we still don't know who this agency is going to be. It's been originally suggested that it would be NetSafe, or a body like NetSafe. As I say, we still don't know who that is going to be, and there's quite a lot of onus going to go on to that agency, whatever it is. And the idea is that agency will work between the parties involved to get information taken down as soon as possible, to mediate between them, to find some resolution between the parties that doesn't involve having to go to court or to pay, for a court case, breach of confidence or whatever it might be. So from that point of view, the aim is more accessibility, and I think it's very attractive from that point of view. If you look at the communications principles, there's 10 of them, and they cover just about every form of published speech that could cause harm under the law in New Zealand at the moment, don't they, Paul? I would say. It covers digital communications that disclose sensitive personal facts, so that's privacy. Digital communications can't be threatening, intimidating or menacing. Those are crimes now. A digital communication can't be grossly offensive to a reasonable person in the position of the individual, whoever it is. They should not be indecent or obscene. They should not be used to harass individuals. They should not make false allegations. That's defamation. They should not contain matters that are published in breach of confidence. They should not incite or encourage anyone to send a message to anyone for the purpose of causing harm, so inciting someone to cause someone else harm. They shouldn't incite or encourage someone to commit suicide, which was one of the great concerns around cyberbullying. And they should not denigrate people because of their colour, race, ethnic, national origins, religion, gender, sexual orientation, all those things under the Human Rights Act. So a toxic blog could offend all of those, almost all of those principles, either altogether or individually, is my view. There has to be serious harm, and then you go to the agency, try and sort the matter out. If you're not happy with what happens there, it's moved into the district court, and it actually becomes a more formalised process, and there things become, as I say, a bit more formalised and probably a bit tougher on the individual involved to actually do that. So there's going to be this remedy, this form of this jurisdiction there that I think will help against toxic blogs generally. What these things require, of course, is courage. You still have to have courage to engage these rights that are in here. And I think the fact that this is a more accessible system, I think, helps that. Moving into a district court process is tougher, I think, on ordinary people. If it's about your privacy, it's tough. If you're scared to complain, then you won't use this process. And I don't know the answer to that. So at the moment, this is in the pipeline. It's not here now. And as I say, I'll be very interested to see what actually happens with this once this legislation is passed. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, question to you first.
Okay.
You've intimated that there may be some legal recourse against Mr Hager, but perhaps more on the unlikely side than the likely, or at least a 50-50 call.
Yeah.
Some people may look at that and think, well, that's just crazy. I mean, here is information that has been stolen. I don't think there's any doubt that this has been obtained through criminal methods. And here it's been able to be splashed all out in the world, even though it's come from criminal methods. So why? Why doesn't the law come down and just say, you can't use this at all?
Well, just because for quite some time there's been this public interest defense, and it'll all come down to the judgment of the court to decide whether the publication was justified in these circumstances or not. And I don't know the answer to that. Mm-hmm. All I can say is, these are the various factors, as I mentioned, that a court would take into account. Personally, I don't know, 50-50. It's not an open and shut case on either side. It would be a slugfest.
So do you think this then opens the door to this sort of behaviour in the future? Is Pandora's box open now? Is this all going to come out? Will future people on both sides be wanting to do this?
Well, I think it's been done already, hasn't it? Cameron Slater got hold of Mark Blumfield's hard drive and started apparently using that on his blog. So, yeah, Pandora's box has been open for some time.
Right. With regards to the Law Commission took this approach that said we want to define what news organisations are. Essentially, if you are one, if you're a journalist, you get all these protections. If you ain't, you aren't. Yeah. Did that get it round the wrong way? Should we actually be looking at journalism to say that if a piece of work is journalism, it's protected, irrespective of who does it?
Yeah, that's my thinking. That's exactly. There was too much focus on whether news stories were churned out, and that was about it. But it's the question of, yeah, as you say, is this journalism? And then that can cover new media, as long as it is journalism. Now, one thing I just wanted to say, I noticed on the feed that someone's saying, well, if you're objecting to paid copy, then all newspapers are going to not be seen as news media and so on. The distinction between news media and news media outlets now, publishing and of course selling newspapers and so on, is that that's after the event. It's not that the way they got the news and the news that they got was paid for to start with, and that's the objection. That's what's being objected to. So the idea of journalism per se, of course, and the courts recognise this and the laws recognise this, of course media has to make money. It is a commercial entity, there's no doubt about that. But that's not what's happening in a sort of a blog that we've been talking about, a blog where there's a blog holding itself out to be news and news media, but is not behaving that way. In fact, it is taking paid copy. It is behaving like either an advertiser or a public relations consultancy.
Of course, Cameron Slater is in court today, seeking an injunction. Would you, either of you, like to talk us through what he's looking for, and then do you want to give a prediction as to what's going to happen?
Look,
up to you.
My feeling about this is it's an interim injunction application, so this is an urgent application dealt with on the papers. The judge won't have that much evidence in front of him. They'll have whatever the parties can get together up to now. And Cameron Slater was saying, I want this now and I want you to decide this now on the papers that you've got. And the judge, in my view, will follow the process that Paul's talked about. Is this confidential information? There's an issue around that because I think in two respects, because as Paul suggested, there can't be confidentiality in iniquity, the idea of information that discloses something unethical or wrong that's gone on, and there can't be confidentiality in information that's already public, as you said. So I think there's a question at that point, isn't there, that can be debated.
There's also the balance of convenience, which might favour Cameron Slater. There wouldn't be any detriment to the news agencies if they delayed publication for a few weeks.
Well,
few months.
And the other issue that I thought works against the media is that often they won't deal with public interest at this point, will they?
No.
They prefer to leave it till the final trial, and they will say we can't deal with it in an interim process. There's not enough information in front of us. So I think this is why Paul. Well, you speak for yourself, but I personally think there's a strong argument of a public interest defence, but I think the circumstances of this application may prevent that from being used effectively at this point.
One last question. To what extent can the law solve things here? Or are these issues that the law may have some impact on, but what we're really talking about are wider cultural issues to do with what the media is prepared to use as a reputable source, etc.? Thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's just unfortunate that things have reached the state that people don't act properly, I suppose, or they mask their real motives. And maybe it's in the interests of society to know where people are coming from when they write their blogs or whatever. But on the other hand, it is a sorry state of affairs where you have to invade someone's privacy to expose that. So it's a lose-lose situation, pretty much.
Yeah, the law can't solve everything. And we've got a tendency in New Zealand to think, let's pass a law, let's sort that out. And that's why, going through these two possibilities here, anything you achieve from that is limited, and it depends on people having courage and time and all of that to use the processes that are there. Getting a definition right of news media, if you can actually develop one, and that's not an easy process. So the answer is it's a mixture of everything. The law can do some things, and then the sorts of things the other panels have been talking about, those grassroots things, those vigilance things, the law can't resource the media better, and it can't, give them more time to go out and keep blogs like Slater's blog honest and so on. That's never going to happen. But we shouldn't make blogs be licensed because of that. It was our newspapers who were licensed back in the 80s was the last time we got rid of licensing, and that will never occur again, especially now that we've got the Bill of Rights with freedom of expression in it. So it's a mixture.
Yeah, and just a final comment about the Harmful Digital Communications Bill. I think it was originally aimed towards school children, because there were surveys done that it was school kids that are mainly the ones to send and receive these harmful messages. And in our usual New Zealand over-regulatory way, we've got a bill here that will maybe bring things back to the playground, so people won't send these messages, they'll just bully in person.
And on that hopeful note, we've now come to the end of our third and final panel discussion. So thank you to our panel members, Professor Paul Roth from the University of Otago's Law Faculty, Professor Ursula Chair from the University of Canterbury School of Law. We'll now take a very short break before we come back for our final segment with the author, Mr. Nicky Hager, to discuss what he thinks of today's proceedings. Thank you. Welcome back. In the last few minutes we have available to us, we turn back to the author of Dirty Politics, Mr. Nicky Hager, for his reflections on the day's discussion. So, Nicky, we've heard a lot of stuff talked through today over quite a range of different issues. The issues bleed into one another, so trying to keep them separate is very difficult. But with regards to the first panel, the discussion of the media landscape, the way in which media has changed, was there anything that came out of that you found particularly useful or that you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, sure. I've been thinking about it all afternoon.
Right.
But let me say first, when you do a piece of work like I've done, a book like this, the one thing you hope is that people will engage with the issues. And I've mostly had people calling me names and not engaging with the issues.
If you'd like, we can.
And I have... certainly.
Sorry.
I really appreciate the contributions that have been made today because I think we should be talking about these things, and it's been beautiful. Okay. Let me talk about a few things. The first one that struck me was it's about people talking about right-wing blogs and left-wing blogs, and later we were talking about journalism. To me, in my work and the way I judge other people, it's not actually about the left or the right of it. It's actually about standards. That the thing that guides us through this and makes it clear is accuracy, fairness, and balance. And if we judge things according to those standards, everything gets much clearer than the other kinds of labels that you put on it. And if we judge the blogs on that, or if people want to judge my work by that, I think we'd be in a much stronger ground.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that goes to the question of standards, also goes to the question of personal ethics, doesn't it? And the reality is that people can make choices about how they want to behave and how they want to pursue their goals and the means that they want to take and to use. Do you think we just need to get a little bit more moral again about how we judge those who are in public life and the kinds of tactics that they're prepared to use to get what they want?
Absolutely. I think some people probably think I wrote a book about rotten, dirty, scummy stuff. What I felt I was writing a book about was ethics, about the choices that people can make at each stage of how they conduct themselves in politics. And my own view is that the reason why lots of things go on is because they can be secret, they can be hidden, they can be managed, and that when you look at it clearly, that most people know exactly what side they stand on. So I see something like my book and the discussion around it as being wholly positive because there'll be people all over the place who are in politics, not in politics yet, but thinking about it, who are in the media, who are in the academia, all over the place, who are thinking, what side do I stand on in these issues? So it's about the choices that each individual makes, and the more people who make the ethical ones, the better system we live in, and the more people who can make the other kind, the more that they determine how the country goes. It's actually the sum of those. It's not a black and white picture.
Do you think the ends ever justify the means? In other words, let's imagine there's people who have certain political outcomes they want. They think if the world is governed according to their view of politics, according to their political ideology, the world will be a much better place. And in order to get that end put in place, there are these particular means that will be successful. Is that sort of reasoning ever justified?
It sounds like it will be justified, except the problem in politics is that it feels like it's always justified because it's always this election and it's always this issue and it's always my standing and it's always whether the polls will go up and down. And so, in fact, it's usually not a good idea. And that there's more than one way to conduct yourself in politics. If your role models are that you see whale oil, he's powerful. He trips up at the opponents of the National Party. He trips up the .com. He smears people. This looks like a really good way to do things. This looks like the way to get ahead. It looks like success. It is success, according to the polls that day. That role model gets itself around. But I believe that the reason we should talk about these things is that there's always more than one way to do it. That there are many people who respond way more positively to the politician who does answer the question, who does admit mistakes, who does speak up for ethical things. And if the role models which are seen to be successful are those negative ones, those less ethical ones, then unfortunately that sends us downwards. Whereas if we talk about the issues and people that do it differently, then we can go up again. That the pessimistic view of history, which is that things always get worse, is never right, actually. There's always different directions at once.
So we talked a little bit about personal ethics and making choices and choosing to be principled. But of course, choices are always made in some sort of institutional structure. We never get to, choose things in a vacuum. And one of the things that was discussed at the politics panel was this idea of political parties having been hollowed out. And so it actually been this form of politics works now because political parties have become shells in a sense, and so you can have individuals who sort of take over at the top of the party and run the party according to their own ways of being without being in check by the members and so on. Do you think that's a reality in New Zealand? Do you think our parties have become shells of a sort?
Definitely, numbers of people in parties has gone down. Two thoughts on this. The first one is, even with a vigorous party, it can be taken over. That was the story of New Zealand in the 1980s and 90s. And it was a traumatizing effect that you could have strong, vigorous civil society and you could still have hijacking, and you can still have people who manage politics from the top. So I don't think it's an either or, and I think that what you do is you discuss it, you expose it, you have people unhappy with it, and then you've got the potential to change it. That's really at the heart of these things. Yeah.
You, at the end of your book, you have, I'll call it a mini manifesto, I'm sure you wouldn't like that word, but you have some suggested ideas for change. Now, I'm not going to ask you to run through all of them here in the last few minutes, but of those changes, what do you think are the most important ones that you think coming out of the book are needed? Yeah,
I didn't want to finish the book on the look at them out there revolting, full stop. There's an afterword which runs through how this could be different and what it takes. And it's about the resources we put into news media, which we all know are going down as the number of PR people in the world goes up. It's about transparency. And actually the most important part for me of that, which sounds obscure, is about the issues of how frightened people are or how empowered people are to participate in politics. And I start with academics and scientists and people like that who have been chilled and who are the kind of targets of people like whale oil. But actually I also think, I'm talking about, like, for example, public servants who believe that they're not allowed to be involved in politics anymore. In other words, people who care about, think about, know about issues, who think they can't go home and be citizens in the evening. Now, these are all issues which are not kind of little side issues. They're actually the fundamental driving issues of whether we can have decent policies and have good politics. And what this comes down to, what is the heart of this, is that word which I'm almost hesitant to say because it sounds kind of tired, but that's about democracy. That's why I said it when I talked earlier, that a lot of this is not about whether you have a left-leaning or a right-leaning. I hope that people from all parts of the political spectrum would feel the same on this. That what's at stake here is really fundamentally at stake is how democratic our governments are. And we tend to have a complacency where we think that a occasional election that gives you a representative parliament is the question of whether or not you have a democracy. But you can have a representative parliament which has almost no democracy. Democracy is made up of the availability of information, the empowerment of individuals in society to be involved. All those structures, the independent voices versus the paid voices when the debates go on, there's all these different levels of what makes democratic government. And if we don't take that seriously, we throw away like the best of what we have as a country. We have to talk about it and think about it.
Going from that, and this idea that we do need to change and so on, you wrote a book before this, The Hollow Men, which examined a development in political strategy. That book came out, it had some impact, but it's had nothing like the impact that this book has had in terms of response, public response, in terms of engagement. Why do you think it's different this time around?
I don't entirely know. I actually think that The Hollow Men is a more important book of the two, to be honest, to be perfectly honest. I'll tell you the main difference, perhaps. The Hollow Men was written in 2006. It was the beginning of the era which I then wrote about in this book. And I think over those years there's been a really strong sense of misgiving for piles of people. There are a band of people who think that I'm a nut and how could I be horrible to that nice man, but there's a large number of people, like a really large number of people, who have been less and less comfortable with politics, have felt more and more pushed out of it, have not seen a place for themselves in the politics of their own country, have disliked the style of politics with the attacks and the manufactured crises and the lack of policy in the way that things have happened. And I'm sure that I'm right that those people feel that way, because when I walk down the street, wherever I go, people are coming up to me and talking about this. I have never seen such a high level of feedback to this. And so I think, why did this book work better? It was a matter of timing, because people are really unhappy about what's going on. And when people were talking about, sort of indifference or that horrible word that gets used to blame the victims of this kind of politics, which is apathy. I really don't believe that. I think there are some people who are cynical. They inherit the cynicism of their part of politics and think all politicians are bad and it's always going to be like this. All right? But there's a whole lot of other people who are just feeling disempowered. And they're the ones who we're seeing reacting to the book in such a strong way and buying it so fast and talking about these things. And the fact that they feel that way should be a great sense of optimism for us. A source of optimism, I mean. Yeah.
Perfect. Mr. Hager, thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our time for this symposium. As I said at the outset, love it or hate it, dirty politics has lit a fire under our perceptions of the way politics is done in New Zealand. It's a fire that's not going to go out on September the 20th, and I suspect it's something that we're going to be talking about for quite some time. As a part of that debate from the University of Otago's Media Studio, we've had people participating from the Department of Media, Films and Communications, the Faculty of Law, the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, and the University of Department of Politics and the University of Canterbury School of Law. If you have missed the full presentation this afternoon, or you want to go back and watch any part of it, it will be available on the University of Otago's YouTube feed. You can go back and watch it at any time. Otherwise, I'd just like to thank everyone who's taken part today, the participants, the audience in the studio, Mr. Hager, who's come down to take part in this, the studio staff for helping out today, and most of all, you out there in interweb land, thank you for watching. Good afternoon. Right on time. That was great. That was really, really good.